I'd like to call the hearing to order and recognize myself for 5 minutes for my opening statement. Since our March 12th hearing on the original discussion draft of the Chemicals and Commerce Act, we've been working on a bipartisan basis to find common... Oh, my apologies. My apologies. My ranking member's not here. I was just busy. All right. Jerry would shut off my time. My apologies. I ran down there. I already galloped. My apologies. Again, let me extend my apologies to my colleagues. I was anxious to get started, so I'll now start again my opening statement for this hearing. Since our March 12th hearing on the original discussion draft of the Chemicals and Commerce Act, we've been working on a bipartisan basis to find common ground. The revised discussion draft before you today contains several significant changes from the earlier version. I won't itemize them now, but I will mention a few highlights. In Section 4, we've added new authority for EPA to require the development of new hazard and exposure information for priority designation purposes. In Section 5, instead of requiring EPA to grant exemptions for byproducts from Section 5 notice requirements, the new draft gives EPA discretion to decide whether to grant such an exemption. Section 6 includes several important changes. The draft now requires EPA to evaluate the risk of harm a chemical substance poses to human health or the environment based upon 4 specific factors. 1 is the nature and magnitude of risk. 2 is the impact on potentially exposed subpopulations. 3 is whether harm has occurred. And 4, the probability that harm will occur from use of a chemical substance. The new draft also makes it explicit that in making such risk evaluations, EPA is not to consider economic costs or benefits. Section 6 also now includes a new alternative risk evaluation option for EPA to determine at any time that a chemical not designated as a high priority will not present a risk of harm in the absence of Section 6 restrictions on it. The section also now adds deadlines for EPA to make action on existing individual chemicals. EPA must complete a risk evaluation within 4 years after designating a chemical as high priority and must promulgate any restrictive rule on an existing chemical within 3 years after finishing the risk evaluation. The revised draft would allow for extensions to factor in additional information, but the total of all extensions could not exceed 3 years. With respect to preemption, we changed the effect of an EPA designation of a chemical substance as low priority. In the previous draft, a low priority designation would have preempted any state regulation of a chemical substance. The revised draft limits the preemption effect of a low priority designation to state regulations established after the low priority designation, leaving in place state regulations in effect when the low priority designation is made. We also want to ensure we are using a strong scientific process, which is why the revised draft streamlines the science and information quality provisions of the bill. Specifically, details about science, including a definition of best available science and some details on information quality requirements, are replaced by codification of 5 science assessment factors currently used administratively by the EPA. The revised draft also clarifies which decisions under TSCA must be made based on weight of such scientific evidence. Today we'll get the reaction of the administration, and we welcome back our friend Jim Jones, Assistant Administrator of the EPA, just for that purpose. We'll also hear from a variety of stakeholders, many of whom will have to live with the Chemicals and Commerce Act once it becomes law. I appreciate all of our committee colleagues who have put so much time and effort into this legislative effort. TSCA reform is neither easy nor simple, and there is still no guarantee that we will succeed in forging a consensus bill this year. All I can promise is my best effort, working directly with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to get there. And with that, I have a minute left. No one seeking recognition on my side. I'd like to yield back my time and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Tonko from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing on the discussion draft for TSCA reform. that was released last week. At the last hearing, we heard from witnesses from industry and the public health community on the initial proposal for revising TSCA. The initial reviews from industry witnesses were mixed, but mostly favorable. The views of the public health, labor, and environmental community were very critical. We have had a lot of helpful testimony from our earlier hearings. Our staffs have been meeting for several months now. And, of course, we have 40 years of experience with the existing law. While this new discussion draft incorporates some new language based on the ongoing discussions, it reflects very little progress on the core issues and problems with the Federal Chemicals Management Program under TSCA. It does not incorporate changes to address the major areas of concern that Democrats have raised. In short, it is disappointing. I'm willing to keep working on this, and I know the other Democratic members who are engaged in this process are also willing to continue. But time is short. We have little time left in this Congress, and we're going to have to engage in a more productive process if the goal is to produce a bill with real potential to become law. This discussion draft falls far short of providing the Environmental Protection Agency with the authorities they need to evaluate the potential risks associated with chemicals currently in commerce or those that are entering the market for the first time. At our last hearing, all the witnesses indicated that the safety standard in the bill should be determined on the basis of health and environmental information alone. Determining how you meet the standard, risk management, should incorporate information about costs and benefits associated with alternate ways to reduce a chemical's risks. This draft does not achieve that necessary distinction. What happened to the safety determination? The public does not have confidence in this program. A revision of TSCA must restore public confidence in the safety of chemical products. Public confidence is indeed good for business, essential for business. The stated purpose of the bill is to provide for the safe and efficient flow of chemicals in interstate and foreign commerce. But once you read beyond the findings, the word safety is not mentioned again until the section of the draft dealing with confidential business information. In that context, there is more emphasis on protecting intellectual property than ensuring that adequate health and safety information are available to risks or respond to an emergency. Mr. Chair, I hoped for more progress by this point, and I'm sure we all did. But this proposal does more to maintain the status quo than it does to move us forward. In some respects, it weakens current law. The draft does not reflect compromise or balance the desires of all stakeholders. A balanced approach is needed to garner broad-based support. Of course, as the majority, you can find the votes to move a bill forward. But a partisan bill that does not incorporate even the most modest recommendations of the public health and environmental communities will not become law. A bill that does not provide EPA with the authorities needed to ensure that chemicals in commerce are safe, authorities that independent analyses by the Government Accountability Office has recommended, will not become law. A bill that broadly preempts states' authorities to protect their citizens will not become law. There is still time to produce a good bill. As I said earlier, I'm willing to continue working on this with you. I believe the reform of TSCA is a worthy effort, that we can craft legislation that would be supported by a majority of our committee's membership. I know the Democratic members want to keep working toward a compromise bill that we can support, that will be supported by this administration and the public interest community and industry, and that has a chance to become law. Let's get back to work on this. We have been very fortunate in having excellent witnesses on this topic. I look forward to today's testimony, and I hope that today's witnesses will provide us with additional suggestions on how to achieve a bill that will serve the public and serve the industry. Thank you all for participating in the important hearing. Again, Mr. Chair, thank you for hosting this hearing.
I thank my colleague. I now turn to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, our work to reform TSCA indeed has come a long, long way. Member interest, direct involvement on a bipartisan basis has been encouraging and helpful, and I understand that we're not quite there yet. But today we're going to get some constructive input from the administration, which is vital on any issue as important and as complex as TSCA reform. While we made changes from our earlier drafts of the legislation, our overarching objectives remain the same. We want to reinforce public confidence in the safety of chemical substances contained in a wide variety of products that we encounter every single day. and we want to ensure the free flow of commerce among states and with our trading partners. Key focus of the legislation is on so-called existing chemicals. These include the thousands of chemicals that have been on the market for decades, which have not gone through the TSCA new chemical review process. Some of these are particularly high priority, especially given human exposure to them. The draft legislation before us today is aimed at initiating a systematic process to review these chemicals and determine which uses of them are safe and whether or not we need any requirements or restrictions. The workload requires both a high level of expertise and effective program management at the EPA. That's why we're especially glad to have Assistant Administrator Jim Jones today with us. We appreciate this technical assistance that you have provided thus far. We want to continue working closely with your agency as we complete work on this legislation. We also welcome our stakeholder panel. We need to hear from them how some of our ideas for structuring the legislation will play out in the real world. Does it reinforce public confidence in chemical safety? Does it encourage innovation and economic growth? We welcome constructive suggestions. I particularly want to thank Mr. Shimkus for his leadership on this issue and efforts to find bipartisan common ground. The law has not been updated in nearly 40 years. It has been a very challenging task. But this draft bill gets us closer towards our objective of a common sense law that indeed does protect the public health and further encourages our manufacturing renaissance. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When the subcommittee convened in March to examine the chairman's proposal to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act, I said I wanted to work with the majority to see if we could reach a bipartisan agreement. My Democratic colleagues and I have been willing to be creative and bridge differences to make progress on this issue. We know that the nation's chemical safety net is broken and inadequate. Unfortunately, if the goal is a broadly supported bipartisan bill, this process is currently failing. To reach agreement, we need to acknowledge that industry cannot get its wish list. No one can. Environmental groups, public health organizations, labor unions, and many others all have important interests at stake. And if we want a law, we'll have to work together to address those concerns. Over the last few months, our staffs have met periodically to discuss TSCA reform, but these discussions have never turned into negotiations. The majority has wanted to write the bill unilaterally, and there has never been an attempt to work out bill language together. It's the chairman's prerogative to handle the subcommittee's business in this way, but I think it's a mistake. Let's look at where the stakeholders are. Since our last hearing, 6 additional industry trade associations have announced their support for this process, though not necessarily for the draft itself. If the goal is building industry support, well, we're making progress. But the public health groups remain in strong opposition to the draft. They say the draft won't protect public health and the environment, and in fact remains weaker than even the status quo of chemical regulation. Key unions and environmental groups share their concerns, and state governments are raising serious objections as well. A key premise of TSCA reform, which has been supported by almost all the stakeholders, is that the quote, cost-benefit, end quote, standard for regulating dangerous chemicals under current law is unworkable and should be replaced by a risk-based approach. But this draft retains the cost-benefit standard, leaving American families and especially children without adequate protection from adverse effects of toxic chemicals. The draft contains sweeping preemption provisions that will preempt popular state and local laws throughout the country, including recently enacted laws relating to hydraulic fracturing. Although it's been requested a number of times, the majority still hasn't explained which state and local laws they intend to target for preemption. The bill would even overturn recent reforms made by EPA to enhance transparency. Under these provisions, EPA would be prohibited from revealing the identity of chemicals that cause serious health and environmental harm. This will harm companies that are marketing safer consumer products and make it difficult, if not impossible, for consumers to protect themselves from toxic exposures. I want TSCA legislation to pass. The President's Cancer Panel found that reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act is critically needed to reduce the incidence and burden of cancer in this country. Chemical exposures are ubiquitous in our society. According to the Centers for Disease Control, their most recent data is that 75% of people tested have the commonly used chemical triclosan and in their bodies. That chemical has been shown to interfere with hormone levels in animals. 75% of people tested had this chemical in their body. CDC also found 5 different PBDEs in more than 60% of participants. These chemicals have been linked to serious health concerns, including rising autism rates. And these chemicals are showing up in the bodies of Americans at levels 3 to 10 times higher than found in European populations. We need a law to protect the public from these exposures, but this process isn't working. We need to bridge our differences, not accentuate them. I'm not ready to give up, but I do have a suggestion. I think we should consider scaling back the ambition of this effort. Let's focus on where we can find agreement. Let's see if we can return to the drawing board and come up with a streamlined proposal that can truly be bipartisan. I'm echoing the sentiments expressed by the ranking member of this subcommittee, and Mr. Chairman, I hope you will take them to heart. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thanks you for your comments. Chair now recognizes the Honorable Jim Jones, Assistant Administrator, Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Your full statement's in the record. You have 5 minutes, and welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss reform of chemicals management in the United States. It is clear that there is wide agreement on the importance of ensuring chemical safety and restoring the public's confidence that chemicals used in the products they and their families use are safe. This administration also believes it is crucial to modernize and strengthen the Toxic Substances Control Act to provide EPA with the tools necessary to achieve these goals and ensure global leadership in chemicals management. We continue to be encouraged by the interest in TSCA reform indicated by the introduction of several bills in recent years, the hearings on TSCA-related issues such as this one that are being held, and the bipartisan discussions that are taking place. Key stakeholders share common principles on how best to improve our chemicals management programs. We at EPA remain committed to working with this committee and others in both the House and the Senate, members of the public, the environmental community, the chemical industry, the states, and other stakeholders to improve and update TSCA. Chemicals are found in almost everything we buy and use. They can be essential for our health, our well-being, and our prosperity. However, we believe that it is equally essential that chemicals are safe. While we have a better understanding of the environmental impacts, exposure pathways, and health effects that some chemicals can have than we did when TSCA was passed, under the existing law, it is challenging to act on that knowledge. TSCA gives EPA jurisdiction over chemicals produced and used in the United States. However, unlike the laws applicable to drugs and pesticides, TSCA does not have a mandatory program where the EPA must conduct a review to determine the safety of existing chemicals. In addition, TSCA places burdensome legal and procedural requirements on the EPA before the agency can request the generation and submission of health and environmental effects data on existing chemicals. It is also proven challenging to take action to limit or ban chemicals that the EPA has determined pose significant health concerns. EPA believes it is critical that any update to TSCA include certain components. In September of 2009, the administration announced principles to update and strengthen TSCA. These include the need to provide the agency with tools to quickly and efficiently obtain information from manufacturers that is relevant to determining the safety of chemicals. The EPA should also have clear authority to assess chemicals against a risk-based safety standard and to take risk management actions when chemicals do not meet the safety standard, with flexibility to consider children's health, economic costs, social benefits, and equity concerns. The principles further state that both chemical manufacturers and EPA should assess and act on priority chemicals, both existing and new, in a timely manner. This means that the EPA should have authority to set priorities for conducting safety reviews on existing chemicals based on relevant risk and exposure considerations. Clear, enforceable, and practicable deadlines applicable to the agency and industry should be set for completion of chemical reviews, in particular those that might impact sensitive subpopulations. Legislation should also provide the EPA with tools to ensure the protections put in place are carried out and provide a level playing field for the companies that comply. On April 22, 2014, a revised version of the Chemicals and Commerce Act discussion draft was released by Chairman Shimkus. While the administration has not yet developed a formal position on the discussion draft, there are several important observations that I would like to offer. As stated in the principles above, we feel strongly that updated legislation should include improvements that will provide the EPA with the ability to make timely decisions if a chemical poses a risk and the ability to take actions appropriate to address that risk. The current discussion draft does not include a mechanism that would provide for the timely review of existing chemicals that may pose a concern, which we believe is vitally important to assuring the American public that chemicals they find in the products they buy are safe. As stated earlier, the use of Section 6 of TSCA to limit or ban a chemical that poses a significant risk has been a major challenge. By including a standard very similar to the current TSCA Section 6 authorities, the bill fails to address another key element of meaningful chemical safety reform. The administration's third principle, which states that when addressing chemicals that do not meet the safety standard, risk management decisions should take into account cost and availability of substitutes, as well as sensitive subpopulations and other factors. The draft bill's unreasonable risk standard does not align with the approach delineated in the principles. The new chemicals provision in Section 5 of the current discussion draft also does not align with the principles in that they do not require that the EPA conclude that new chemicals are safe and do not endanger public health and the environment, elements of Principle 2 and another keystone of credible chemicals management. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your leadership on TSCA reform. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you or members of the subcommittee have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. And before I start, we gave your staff a heads up, and I think they have a copy of the draft bill, and I would ask that they give that to you, as I'll probably refer some pages in my opening questions. And I'd like to recognize myself for the first 5 minutes. Your written testimony suggests the discussion draft does not have a risk-based standard for review of chemicals that does not consider cost or benefits, and suggests that the standard in the discussion draft is very similar to current Section 6. Let's take a look at Section 6B in the discussion draft. That's page 35, line 15 to 22. And again, we gave your folks a heads up that we'd be doing this, so. And now, in the old draft, that was a quote-unquote safety determination. The new draft puts focus on risk by calling it more appropriately a risk evaluation, in quotation. You agree that the new draft takes a phrase of, quote, and I quote, unreasonable risk out of Section 6B, don't you?
Out of Section 6B, I believe that's accurate.
So that's yes. Instead, Section 6B of the discussion draft requires EPA to evaluate a chemical for significant risk of harm to human health or the environment. Isn't that correct? That's page 35, line 15 to 22 also.
That's correct for Section 6B, yes.
Thank you. And it lays out explicit factors to weigh in making the risk evaluation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's in page 37, line 16, and page 38, line 10. And EPA is directed not to consider costs and benefits at this stage. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And that's in page 38, line 11 through 23. And Section 6B includes requirements that EPA consider the likely impact of the chemical to potentially exposed subpopulations. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So there are some things that you like about this revised draft.
Yes, absolutely there are.
Thank you.
Things that I like about it.
I think that the surprising thing was in your opening statement, there was no acknowledgement, and some of my colleagues on the other side make no acknowledgement of some significant movements that have been made in some of these areas. Your written statement suggests that the discussion draft version of Section 5 is weaker than existing Section 5, and we hear that from my friends on the other side. So isn't the quote-unquote may present determination in Section 5C3 of the discussion draft, that's page 22, the exact same as what is contained in current Section 5C?
Well, that may well be the case. I don't have existing TSCA in front of me, but if you'd like, I can talk about why I think that.
Well, I mean, is may present in this draft and is may present in current law in Section 5?
It is, but
Okay.
the subsequent findings that the EPA needs to make.
Well, that's what we'll follow up on in these questions. Isn't the Section 5 rulemaking authority substantially similar to what EPA currently has available to it under Section 5E or 5F on page 23?
I think the existing TSCA Section 5E standard is allows the agency much more flexibility to prevent a chemical from getting on the market.
So your testimony is that this is where it might be weaker because you do not think that this language that we have is substantially similar to current Section 5.
That's correct.
Okay. And we would then ask for you, what kind of language would the EPA propose to clean that up?
Yep, sure. So,
Because all due respect to my friends on the minority side, we've been asking for months for language and never received any language from anyone on the minority side. So it's tough to negotiate when we pose language and we don't receive any in return. Let me go to, please state whether you support or oppose the following policy choices in the discussion draft. Expanding EPA's existing TSCA authority to require new testing by manufacturers and processors via rule, order, or consent agreement. Does this draft do that?
yes, it does.
And isn't order, the ability to do an order a significant improvement over current law
Yes.
and previous drafts?
Yes, it is.
So that's a good thing.
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you. And you're smiling. I like that. Providing this testing authority for prioritization if existing information is not sufficient. Does this draft do that?
It does.
Another good thing.
That's a good thing. Yep.
Providing this testing authority for performing a risk evaluation on high priority chemicals. Does this draft do that?
Yes, it does that.
Providing this testing authority to ensure compliance with control measures for new and existing chemicals. Does this draft do that?
You know, Chairman Shimkus, I can't remember specifically whether it does that, as I don't recall that.
Okay, but you can see my line of questioning.
Yes.
The answer is we believe it does. My time's expired. I'd like to now, I have two more, but in lieu of time, I'll let Mr. Tonko now ask questions for 5 minutes.
Assistant Administrator Jones, there are many serious issues with this bill, but I would like to focus on the expansive preemption provisions. Later today, State Senator Michael Moore from the National Conference of State Legislators will testify that, and I quote, states have enjoyed a long history of co-regulation with the federal government in environmental protection and have made sound policy decisions benefiting the American public. He goes on to say that the discussion draft will, and I quote, strip states residents of protections enacted by their elected officials, and again, quote, leave everyone more susceptible to increased harm from toxic chemicals. Mr. Jones, do you agree that the states play an important role in protecting human health and the environment from exposure to toxic chemicals?
I do agree with that.
The preemption language in the discussion draft is sweeping in scope. We looked at the type of state or local laws and regulations that could be affected. The list is staggering. So, Mr. Jones, would you agree that the preemption language in this discussion draft is very broad?
I would agree it's very broad.
In fact, this language is drafted so broadly that state and local regulations of hydraulic fracturing and the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing could be preempted. Section 17 preempts state and local governments from establishing or implementing a law or regulation requiring the development or submission of information relating to a chemical substance. This could have serious consequences for state requirements for well operators to disclose the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing fluids. So, Mr. Jones, do you agree that the preemption language could jeopardize state laws requiring the oil and gas industry to disclose the chemicals used in their hydraulic fracturing?
Yes, Congressman Tonko, I believe that 17A1(4) right off the bat will preempt some existing disclosure requirements, and then other elements of the provision would do it prospectively. So I think there will be some right off the bat that are preempted for some number of chemicals, and then prospectively there will be continuing additional chemicals preempted.
Thank you. And what about other states or local laws that are simply notices or disclosures about chemicals? It seems to me they would also be in question. Would you agree?
Yes. I would.
With respect to the identified problems with TSCA, lack of public confidence, lack of public information about chemicals, timely action to address chemical risks, would you say this sweeping preemption provision is likely to do more or do less to address these issues?
I think that it will, over time, the role of states will be diminished, and I think that that will decrease the pressure on the agency to move forward as aggressively as I think the drafters were hoping.
And Section 17 preempts any state or local requirement that prohibits or restricts the use of a chemical substance for its so-called intended conditions of use. The bill includes disposal of a chemical as an intended use. As a result, this language could even override state or local laws that limit how drillers dispose of chemical-laden wastewater from hydraulic fracturing operations. In New York, for example, numerous counties have passed laws prohibiting out-of-state well operators from disposing of hydraulic fracturing wastewater in county municipal water treatment plants or using the wastewater to treat local roadways in winter. Mr. Jones, are these the type of restrictions that could be preempted by this measure?
As I was saying earlier on some of the issues like notification, I think 17A1B4 actually will do that for a number of chemicals, and then other provisions could do that prospectively depending on decisions made at the EPA after the law was passed.
Thank you. And since we have not received any specific examples of state and local regulations that are hampering the $770 billion United States chemical business, I find this debate quite confusing. States have moved to regulate chemicals in response to public concern because the federal program is not functioning properly. Instead of blocking the states from responding to public concerns about chemicals, I believe we should address the real problem of inadequate authorities from your agency. Do you agree with that assessment?
I would agree with that.
Frankly, with a stronger federal program, I believe there would be less public pressure to enact state and local laws for chemical regulation. The public health, labor, and environmental groups have stated that this draft would, and I quote, curtail functioning state programs in exchange for a federal program that will continue to be dysfunctional. And I don't think we ought to let that happen. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Jones, thanks very much for being with us today. Appreciate your testimony. In your November 13th testimony, you testified that current TSCA challenges legal and procedural requirements on the agency before it can require industry to generate and submit health and environmental effects information and data on existing chemicals. Does the Section 4 of the April discussion draft improve the agency's ability to require the submission of hazard and exposure data and information by authorizing EPA to obtain it by rule, consent, agreement, or issuing an order?
Yes, it does.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Does the April discussion draft eliminate the need for EPA to find a substance poses an unreasonable risk before requiring new data to be developed?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. And also in your testimony, you discuss how there are 84,000 chemicals listed on the TSCA inventory, and EPA's most recent snapshot of chemicals actually in commerce from the 2012 chemical data reporting, the CDR rule captured 7,674 chemicals from 2011. Do you believe that the 7,674 number is accurate of the current TSCA inventory, or where do you believe that number would be today?
Thanks. It's the 7,000 number are chemicals that are produced at greater than 25,000 pounds per year at any given facility. The 84,000 number are those chemicals that have ever been on the inventory. So the actual number of chemicals in commerce would fall between those two. I think that the 7,000 number captures those that are that are produced at relatively large quantities. There's clearly going to be some number of compounds that are manufactured less than 25,000 pounds, or at a single facility that just are not required to report under the CDR.
Okay, and then when we talk about that 84,000 number, is that correct or is that misleading?
It depends on how one uses it. We don't think it reflects the number of chemicals in commerce. It reflects the number of chemicals that have ever been placed on the TSCA inventory. So we think it doesn't reflect the number of chemicals in commerce.
Okay, and then you also mentioned in your testimony on page 2, I saw that the 60,000 or so chemicals that were grandfathered in 1976, how long would you estimate it would take to evaluate those 60,000 chemicals?
Well, yeah, that sort of goes back to your earlier observation about the 7,400 number. I think that represents the universe of chemicals we would want to keep our sights on first, because they're the ones that are being produced at relatively large quantities. And for that universe, I think it would take some time for the agency to get through all.
Well,
of that.
on an estimate, just like, not just on the 60,000, but on that 7674 number, how long would you just a ballpark estimate that take?
It would take several decades to get through all number of that.
When you say like 30 years, then you say several.
That's not
okay.
Any
idea what would the cost be to do that evaluation on those? Not on the 60,000, no, just going back to the 7,600.
So in the early years, because we're required to set priorities, we'd be doing the harder things first, and so we would be doing fewer of them in early years. I think after we got through the first 1,000 or so, I think you would see the number we would complete in a given year could potentially increase very dramatically, so that you'd see in latter years much higher number of chemicals being assessed than you would see in early years, even though you might have the same number of dollars being spent in any given year. We have not costed out what it would take to get through all of the chemicals. The discussion draft actually doesn't require us to operate at any pace, and so it would be hard to estimate what it would take to get through when you don't have a pace that you're mandated to work through.
And also, doesn't the state preemption under the discussion draft only kick in if EPA hasn't taken action on a particular chemical?
Well, that's and it may have been a drafting issue. I don't know, but I've referred to a number of times, and I'm sorry if I'm misstating it, but the provision in 17A1B, and I believe it is 4, actually preempts a state if the agency, before passage of the law, has issued an order, a consent agreement, a rule under sections 5 or 6, and that's a rather large universe of chemicals, in particular under section 5. So and again, I'm not really sure what that provision was designed to do, but the way we're reading it, it preempts things from the date that the law passed for anything that already has a significant new use rule, anything that already has a consent agreement. Other than that provision, what you said, Congressman, is accurate. It is prospective action on that part of the EPA.
Well, thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back time. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For decades, the Toxic Substances Control Act has operated under an unreasonable risk standard, which requires EPA to perform a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether or not a chemical is to be regulated. This approach has proven unworkable. Only 5 chemicals have been regulated under Section 6 of TSCA since 1976. Mr. Jones, you testified in November that EPA needs to have clear authority to assess chemicals against a risk-based safety standard and to take risk management actions when the chemicals do not meet that standard. Costs would still come into play in figuring out how best to regulate a chemical, but we shouldn't use cost to determine whether the public should be protected from a chemical exposure. Not only has EPA endorsed this risk-based approach, so have a broad range of stakeholders. At our last hearing in March, there was unanimous agreement among the witnesses that chemicals should be held to a risk-based safety standard. Mr. Jones, does the revised draft use a risk-based safety standard, or does it maintain a cost-based approach to risk?
It, Congressman, takes a risk cost balancing, which is pretty much the standard in TSCA right now.
So if this language were enacted, EPA would have to balance the economic costs of regulating against the adverse health and environmental effects of a chemical before establishing any protections. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
I'd like to explore how this would work in the real world. Let's say that this language is enacted and EPA evaluates a toxic chemical. Let's say that EPA determines that the chemical causes cancer. Before EPA would be able to take any action at all to limit the chemical's use in children's products, for example, EPA would need to weigh the costs to the industry of such action. Is that right?
That's correct.
So this proposal would require EPA to look at the cost to industry in determining whether to protect our kids from chemicals that cause cancer. Is that accurate?
We would have to take into consideration the cost to industry and any broader societal costs as well.
Okay. I think many in the public would listen to this discussion and find this proposal morally questionable. I share those concerns, and we don't need to take this approach. Time and again, we've shown that when there's a clear goal for protecting health, industry has the creativity and know-how to get the job done. I'm also concerned whether the approach in this draft is even workable. Is EPA good at projecting industry innovation? Will EPA give the proper weight to industry costs?
That's a great question, Congressman. We tend to have a very difficult time predicting where innovation's going, so we often, almost always, will predict the cost in the absence of innovation and then just straight line it out. Our experience, however, has shown that industry is incredibly innovative, and rarely do those costs hold over time. They typically drop off quite dramatically as industry innovates, and those costs go away.
So as a result, when you look at the costs, you end up overstating those costs because you really can't predict whether they're going to be innovative enough to hold down the costs.
That's correct.
Do you think that we can protect our kids and keep industry's costs manageable if we use a risk-based standard that sets a clear goal of protecting health and the environment?
I believe we can. Just to be clear, the administration principle thinks that it should be risk-based standards, that cost should be a factor in how we achieve the standard, but it has a role, as opposed to having a balancing of trying to numerically quantify the monetary value of the benefits with the monetary value of the costs.
But not in setting the standard itself.
In setting the standard, we think we need to have the flexibility to consider costs in the setting of the standard.
Mm-hmm. But you would set the standard with the expectation that the standard would be met, and you're not looking at just what the industry says the cost will be, because you can take into account, if you have flexibility, that almost always in the environmental area, the costs are less than what is predicted.
The goal would always
beginning.
be to achieve the safety standard. We would want to be able to consider if the scenario where there are very high costs for very marginal changes in safety, that we may have a little lower bar in that kind of a context. We would not want to be precluded from having a cost consideration.
Let me just say in closing, Mr. Chairman, that I think there's a consensus outside this room that the safety standard in TSCA should be risk-based. I'm disappointed the draft doesn't reflect that consensus. I understand there'll be a markup of this bill later the month, and I hope we'll be able to focus on areas of agreement and abandon these controversial proposals. Yield back my time. Thanks.
Gentleman yields back time. Chair now recognizes Chairman Emeritus Mr. Barton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just heard from the Chairman Emeritus on the Democratic side, or the former Chairman, and the current ranking member. I'm the former Chairman and Chairman Emeritus on the majority side. So you kind of get the good, the bad, and the ugly here, I guess. Mr. Waxman seems to think that this discussion draft is too strong. and he talked about the risk-based standard approach that he would prefer. I think, quite frankly, Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Upton and their staffs are trying very hard to find the middle-of-the-road approach, and I have some unease that maybe they're going too far to the left, quite frankly, but I understand what they're attempting to do. So you get both sides of it in these two rounds of questioning. My first question to you, as an assistant administrator of the Office of Chemical Safety, is that a Senate confirmation position, or is that a political appointee but not Senate confirmed?
It's a Senate confirmed position.
It is Senate confirmed. And what did you do before you assumed this position?
I have been a career employee at the EPA until Administrator Jackson asked me if I would be interested in the Senate confirmed position.
So you have I would assume you have a technical background in this field in terms
I actually have a policy and economics background.
Okay. I wasn't here when you gave your opening statement. I would assume that EPA either has no position or is moderately opposed to this. Is that fair?
We've identified a number of areas that we think are not in alignment with the administration principles that we have pointed out.
If the gentleman would yield just for a second, but in being fair, he also identified a lot of yes answers to my questions on positive movements of this bill. Would that be correct, Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I would hope so. Well, given how hard you're working to make it acceptable, I think that's a good thing. If what the chairman has suggested in these proposed changes stick, what would the recommendation be in terms of passage if we get it out of committee and to the floor? Do you think the administration would
I think the administration would like to see a bill that aligns with its principles, and I think that the areas where I've pointed out that are not in alignment are a big enough deal that there would be the administration would have some problems with the.
What's the biggest problem in the discussion draft?
I think the safety standard is probably the biggest one. The new chemicals issue I pointed out is probably second, and then the pace of the agency work on existing chemicals. Those are probably the biggest areas.
If you go out into the real world, I think that the industry that TSCA regulates have really tried to do the right thing. Where do you see the biggest problem? Is it non-compliance with existing regulations, or is it new? Is it the new chemicals coming online that are the biggest problem? Are existing chemicals the industry not properly evaluating under current law?
That's a great question, Congressman Barton. I couldn't agree with you more. As a matter of fact, until this hearing was called, I was supposed to be in Bentonville, Arkansas today at Walmart, who I think has been a real leader in this space and trying to get ahead on safer chemicals. I think some of the companies coming behind me in the next panel have been real leaders. New chemicals, I don't believe, is where the challenge has been. I think it has been with existing chemicals, and there I think it's a subset of existing chemicals. We looked at about 1,000 chemicals of that entire universe that Congressman Latta pointed out as chemicals that have expressed some hazard that we think it's really important for the agency to evaluate for safety assessment purposes. But because we never have done that, unless a retailer was telling you they won't accept it, I don't know why a company wouldn't continue to manufacture those. So I think it's existing chemicals in there. I think it's actually a relatively narrow subset. I'm talking about 1,000 and not 40,000 or 20,000.
Right.
Still a big number, but I agree that I think many consumer-facing companies and retailers have been way out front on this issue, much further out front than we have.
My time's expired, but Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you and the ranking subcommittee member, Mr. Tonka. It sure looks to me like y'all are trying to find a middle approach, and I'm supportive of that, but I do from the right want to say let's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we still want to. If we're going to get a revision, it needs to be something that will work in the real world. And I am leery of continuing to give EPA too much discretion, because I think the more explicit we can be in what they should do, the greater the probability is that they will do their regulatory function in a fair manner. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. I commend you for the hearing, and I am very pleased to see you working on this legislation. Back in 1976, I submitted a report language in regard to weaknesses that exist in the current Toxic Substances Control Act. I stated it was essential for the protection of the public health and the environment that EPA have a firm mandate for a comprehensive approach to protection from hazards due to chemical substances, and that such success could only be achieved through legislative directives and adequate funding support. Mr. Jones, you stated in your testimony that in order to be successful, EPA must have the resources it needs to protect the American people from exposure to harmful chemicals. I'm satisfied that that has been a lack that you have confronted down there. Now, under CICA, does EPA have appropriate resources to quickly and efficiently implement the various framework, process, criteria, and guidance provision which must be in place prior to EPA beginning action on specific chemicals? Yes or no?
I think it's more a question, Congressman Dingell, of a year, which is were provided, is probably a little bit too short.
So you're telling me no on this, and I'm asking you to submit to us additional information so that we will have a clear picture of what the needs are. And I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Chairman, and other matters be inserted in the record in the appropriate fashion.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now, again, Mr. Jones, once EPA is able to take action on specific chemicals under CICA, does EPA have the resources needed to quickly and efficiently determine prioritizations, assessments, determination, and risk management? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, Congress. There's a little more than yes or no questions, but the bill doesn't require
just yes or no.
Well, the bill doesn't.
And I'm asking you to submit in greater detail because we don't have a lot of time to dance around on this.
I would say yes, but the number we would do would be, I think, disappointingly small.
Well, that's almost a comical answer here. Now, EPA has over 84,000 chemicals listed in its TSCA inventory, and a little over 200 have been acted on in 37 years. It doesn't make it look like you have authority here or that you have resources. EPA has identified an initial work plan of chemicals for assessment, which includes 83 substances, in addition to identifying several hundred chemicals on the safer chemical ingredients list. Is that true? Yes or no?
Yes.
All right. Under current TSCA, does EPA have the appropriate resources to complete more than 20 risk assessments per year on existing chemicals?
No.
Please answer yes or no.
No.
Would you respond in addition for the record on that matter?
Yes.
Now, what kind of resources would EPA need in order to perform 20 or more additional risk assessments per year? Please submit that for the record.
Sure.
So we have a decent appreciation of our needs here. Now, as you know, I've had the privilege to live in the Great Lakes region, home for 20% of the world's freshwater supply, as well as tremendous hunting and fishing and recreational areas. Many of my constituents have voiced concerns that CICA does not ensure adequate public health and safety standards needed for high-risk toxic chemical contamination found in this region. Would EPA be better able to regulate new and existing chemicals if they were granted authority to set priorities for conducting safety reviews based on relevant risks and exposure conditions? Yes or no?
Yes.
Would you please submit application for the record on that? Now, if both chemical manufacturers and EPA had the ability to assess and act on priority chemicals like those potentially found in the Great Lakes, would EPA be better able to regulate these chemicals in a timely manner? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, would you please submit amplification on that for the purposes of the record?
Yes.
Now, it is my concern that if Congress fails to provide necessary funding to a new TSCA program, public health protections will be left without legs to stand on. As I mentioned in a number of previous hearings, any overhaul of this law must be a broad bipartisan one. It's my hope that this subcommittee will find a process to ensure that all stakeholders have the opportunity to see their concerns reflected in a final bill. I continue to be committed to fulfilling this need, and I intend to work with my colleagues in creating reform that industry, consumers, environmental, and public health groups desperately want and need. And you, Mr. Chairman, I commend you for your legislation and for the hearings. I thank you. These are questions that have got to be answered if we're to proceed in a proper way on this. This is a piece of legislation that's sat around, and I think we'll probably sit around until hell freezes over if something's not done about it. So thank you for your leadership.
I thank my colleague, and Chair now recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just begin by applauding you. Your line of questioning at the beginning of this hearing they were right on. You were able to demonstrate that there has been progress made with it, and I appreciate that. I think they were very good questions with that. I'm just curious, Mr. Jones. Mr. Tonko said that this current draft weakens current law. I heard Mr. Waxman say that it doesn't protect public health. I heard him then go on to say that it may even be, chemicals may be contributing to the rate of autism in this country. So you agree with all those three statements?
We've been trying to evaluate.
Yes or no?
We've been trying to evaluate this
Yes
and
or no,
other
please.
forms of legislation.
Do you agree with it, that it weakens current law?
I don't think I would take an opinion on that.
Okay. Does it weaken public safety, public health?
It does not advance public health in the way that we think.
Does it have a link to autism?
One of the problems that we have in the chemical space is that because there's not been enough data generated, it's hard to make statements with respect to.
I'm just curious, if it does any of those three, who's responsible for that? Is it the industry? Are we developing a profile across America? Is that what's trying to come out of this Congress? Is the chemical industry is trying to weaken existing law? It wants to increase autism. It wants to decrease public health. Is that what you see in an overview of 30,000 feet, what this bill does?
I see an honest effort on the part of a lot of people to make improvements, and I see disagreements amongst stakeholders as to whether or not it's
But
being
if the
achieved.
threat continues to be that it's doing these and other things, you're saying about safety and new chemicals, if it has, I want to make sure I understand your testimony and those from the other side of the aisle, that this is the chemical industry itself is causing these problems, because if it's not the chemical industry, then it's our staff is writing these things to decrease public safety and public health and weaken the current law. Who wrote the words to make it negative?
I am on the outside here, and I am not holding the pen, and I can't speak to the motivations, nor do I choose to try to understand really the motivation.
Do you really think the chemical industry is trying to hurt the public health?
No, I don't.
Okay. Do you think it's trying to weaken current law?
I think those are questions for the chemical industry who are coming up right behind me.
No, that was your opinion. Maybe we'll ask them later. But do you really think they want to weaken current law?
Again, I don't.
Yes or no?
I've been in this game for quite a long time, and I don't attempt to understand all the motivations behind all of the players. I try to evaluate the facts that are in front of me and make informed decisions based on that.
Do you really think that the rate of autism is going to be affected by this TSCA reform legislation?
I think that if we had better health and safety data, we'd be making more informed and protective decisions around chemical safety in the United States.
I'll be curious to see. My grandson's autistic, and in a number of meetings and discussions we've had with doctors about this, they've never talked about the chemical industry being behind this. I just wonder perhaps if this is just one more scare tactic to try to cause consternation and confusion in our economy right now, because we've not heard that. So this was the first time I've heard that today. And shame on people if they're using scare tactics to try to get something, because I think this committee has done a yeoman's job in trying to correct the problems. And I don't think it's the chemical industry that is trying to weaken any of these provisions. I think there's another agenda out there, and I'd sure like to understand. I hope that you'll be able to submit something to explain why people think the chemical industry wants to put the health of this nation at risk.
I can only speak to what the administration is attempting to achieve, which is to strengthen the chemical safety laws in the United States.
Thank you. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back time. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last few months, my staff has been at the table with your staff to discuss the draft Chemicals and Commerce Act and work towards a compromise bill. Changes have been made since the initial draft, but unfortunately the version before us today does not reflect sufficient input from Democratic members, including myself. At the last TSCA hearing on March 12th, every witness in attendance stated that chemicals and commerce should be held to a risk-based standard without consideration of costs. But unfortunately, the draft before us does not meet that standard. Further, vulnerable populations are not sufficiently protected under the risk management standard in the draft. So, Mr. Chairman, obviously reforming TSCA is crucial to protecting Americans from unsafe chemicals, and I'm disappointed in the current draft before us today. And I would simply ask that before the subcommittee moves to mark up this bill, that you work to address the concerns raised by myself and other Democratic members. I had...
Would the gentleman yield for 1 second?
Certainly, sure.
And I would ask that my friends on the other side start sharing some language with us, which we've been asking for probably 6 weeks.
Okay. Thank you. Let me ask some questions of Mr. Jones. The Toxic Substances Control Act requires that when EPA needs to regulate a chemical, it must use the least burdensome option. And this least burdensome requirement is widely recognized as one of the biggest obstacles to effective implementation of TSCA. Since EPA's failed attempt to regulate asbestos and the corrosion-proof fittings decision, EPA has been saddled with performing time and resource-intensive cost-benefit analysis on every potential alternative, not just the final regulatory control option selected. So, Mr. Jones, you referred to this problem as paralysis by analysis in the past. Is this a problem that should be addressed in TSCA reform?
It absolutely is a problem that should be addressed in TSCA reform.
Now, the draft removes the language least burdensome, but replaces it with a new requirement for cost effectiveness. So in your assessment, does this draft risk recreating the problems of the least burdensome requirement with this new cost effectiveness requirement?
Thanks, Congressman. I think it would be important in legislation to be clear about how expansive the cost-effective analysis would need to be. What we would be worried about is that a court would decide that all 12 or so options of risk management had to be evaluated for us to be able to say that the one we selected was cost-effective. Another reading would be, as long as we've looked at a couple of options that bound the options, that we would have achieved the cost-effective. Cost-effective is a relative term inherently, so I think it would be useful to have clarity on that point, so that we don't have the same kind of paralysis by analysis that least burdensome created.
Well, would the EPA be able to act more effectively, but still adequately considering the effects of its actions if this cost-effective requirement were to be deleted?
That would be a way to achieve that objective.
All right. The bill also establishes a new requirement that when EPA decides to limit the use of a chemical for a specific use, the agency has to determine that alternatives are technically and economically feasible. And this puts EPA in the position of having to project market innovation rather than relying on the market to develop safer alternatives as necessary. So Do you have concerns about that requirement?
I think that you're right that there's an anti-innovation aspect of that we have seen over and over again in many, many different contexts, the ability of the American industry to innovate things that may not have been available at any given time, and our ability to predict that's very limited.
So, Mr. Jones, when you look at the provisions we just discussed, are you concerned that they could have the effect of protecting the market position of dangerous chemicals and articles rather than spurring innovation?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, as I previously mentioned, I think they should be removed from the draft to enable EPA to act and to encourage innovation. And those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jones, are you familiar with Canada's approach when it prioritized 23,000 chemicals on its domestic substances list several years ago?
I have some familiarity with the Canadian approach, yes.
Well, after Canada completed its prioritization, it set aside approximately 19,000 chemicals as essentially low priority. Canada does not intend to conduct risk assessment on those substances unless new information indicated a need to reevaluate that approach. Does the April draft provide the agency authority to similarly review chemical substances in U.S. commerce and identify substances that may not warrant a reevaluation?
It does. I would not be able to speak to the standard that Canada used to call something a lower priority versus the standard that has been in the discussion draft. We've not thought about it in that context, but we would be able to set priorities.
Well, in the proposed assessment of grandfathered chemicals, do you believe some form of prioritization would be key?
I think it's very important.
Yeah. Now, your prepared statement seems to suggest that you want a registration and licensing program under TSCA for new chemicals. Do I understand you correctly?
No, I don't. I just think it's important for the agency, before a chemical moves to the market, to speak to its safety.
Do you believe that EPA will be able to make screening level priority determinations for most existing chemicals based on information that is currently available to the agency?
I believe that there are enough existing chemicals, that for the first probably dozen years, we will be able to focus our work on those chemicals for which we can make such determinations. And then I think we will need to be in the mode of data gathering for chemicals that are not well characterized.
Do you think the agency would have any difficulty showing why available information on a chemical is insufficient for priority setting or risk evaluations, and hence why new information might be needed by the agency for one of the regulatory purposes outlined in sections for Section 4A1?
I think we'd be able to do that, yes.
In your testimony on November 13th before the subcommittee, you testified that a necessary improvement to TSCA is a mandatory program that gives EPA the authority to review the safety of existing chemicals. Does the April discussion draft include such a program?
It moves in that direction. What I think it's lacking is a requirement that the agency set a certain number of high priorities every year. Once a chemical is determined a high priority, we are then on a pace. We have 4 years to do a safety assessment, and then 3 years after that to do risk management. But the agency could choose to have a very, very low number of chemicals that set it as high priority. I'm thinking creating something that creates that constant forward motion with some robust number, I think would be important.
Is a 4-year deadline to complete risk evaluations established in Section 6 sufficient time for the agency?
Yes, it is.
Does the April draft provide flexibility, enough flexibility to take into account a range of considerations when chemicals do not meet a safety standard, including children's health, economic costs, social benefits, equity concerns? Does that draft provide the flexibility to the agency that you desire in Section 6?
I think it requires a determination that this cost-benefit balancing that we think is will make it hard to be effective and is not as health protective as we'd like it to be.
And does the discussion draft prohibit EPA from considering cost and benefits when making a risk evaluation on a chemical substance?
It prohibits us in the risk evaluation phase, yes.
In the risk evaluation. Yeah, my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman. Mr. Jones, in your testimony, you mentioned that the TSCA does not require the EPA to conduct a review and determine the safety of existing chemicals. You mentioned that the TSCA places burdensome legal and procedural requirements on the EPA before the agency can request health and environmental effects on existing chemicals.
Correct.
So my question is, the Chemicals and Commerce Act gives the EPA 90 days to develop a profile of a particular chemical substance and the potential for exposure to humans and the environment. As of today, could the EPA meet this 90-day time frame?
For new chemicals, we currently meet that time frame in the vast majority of chemicals we're looking at, new chemicals.
Okay, thank you. Would asking companies to provide the EPA with a minimum data set assist the agency in making timely, informed determinations on these chemicals?
We don't believe a standardized minimum data set is warranted for new chemicals and or for existing chemicals, for that matter.
Do you believe it would be beneficial for the United States to use the European model as a template?
No, but I believe it would be beneficial to use the data generated for purposes of the European model. It would be very beneficial to chemical safety in the United States.
Is that permitted in the Chemicals and Commerce Act?
It's not prohibited. Some of the problems that we're dealing with relate to the way in which the European model was created and some of the agreements manufacturers who join consortia have with respect to when they can provide data. But the U.S. law, I don't believe, can require another government to give us something or a company who doesn't operate here to give us something. So I think these are some issues that just need to get worked through.
Is there an opportunity in the Chemicals and Commerce Act to do that?
I think it's worth exploring.
Thank you. We've heard from the GAO and other stakeholders throughout this process that the EPA needs more information and testing, but these so-called scientific standards in the new draft simultaneously restrict the EPA's testing authority while establishing a mandatory duty to the EPA to consider a prescriptive list of elements when evaluating studies and tests. Mr. Jones, if enacted, would the scientific standards language provide additional opportunities for litigation, in your opinion?
I think it would. I think it deserves some looking at to make sure there aren't that. I would expect unintended consequence.
Increased litigation could result in scientific issues being resolved in the courtroom.
That's correct.
Are judges well equipped to make decisions about scientific issues?
I prefer not to. But I think in general that they would prefer that they're made in agencies like the EPA.
Right. So we should be concerned about putting courts in the position of rendering judgments on scientific matters.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Administrator Jones, I wanted to ask you a series of questions about fees and fee structure. So all of these will be quick questions. And first of all, how does the agency, how does the EPA currently collect user fees under TSCA?
We right now have authority to collect them only for the pre-manufacturer notices, the new chemicals, and it's at a relatively small amount of money, partly because that money goes directly to the Treasury. EPA does not get those fees right now, and it's only for pre-manufacturer notices.
Well, that leads to the second question. Does the EPA anticipate that user fees would be additive or a replacement for some of your existing funds as appropriated?
I believe if the Congress's intent was that we move quickly and do many chemicals, that they would need to be additive to our existing resources.
What is your budget breakdown by category for the individual sections of TSCA?
Funny you should ask that.
If that's going to take too long, I'll just skip down to the next.
I got it right here. There we go. So we spend about just under $17 million for new chemicals, about $28 million for existing chemicals, and $12 million or thereabouts on the information systems that service both of those.
So what is the EPA budget in both funding and full-time equivalents for the chemical review under Section 5?
Ballpark about $16.7 million.
I'm sorry, how much?
Just under $17 million, $16.7 million for Section 5.
And what would the agency expect the outlays to be under the new TSCA Section 4 authority?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
What would the agency expect its outlays to be under the new TSCA Section 4 authority?
You know, we spend about $12 million now in data gathering, but we have not costed out under the discussion draft what we would spend under that authority. Interestingly, we would probably be getting more data, but it would be cheaper to get it because orders are much cheaper to do than rulemakings are.
How about Sections 6, 8, and 14?
So I have costs for what we're spending now on Section 6 and the other existing chemicals programs, but we've not costed out what it would be under the discussion draft. But it does allow me to make some general ballpark estimates of what a chemical under the provision would cost us.
Let me try this one. To evaluate 20, let's say 20 chemicals per year, how much money and staff do you think you would need?
I think early days where we're trying to work on the more difficult ones first, because the higher priority ones should be the more difficult ones. Sure. I think about $1 million per chemical, so $20 million. Over time, $20 million will go a lot farther than that as the chemicals get easier to do. But at the beginning, I'd say 20 chemicals.
Yeah, that sort of leads to the rest of that question. What would you need to evaluate 50 chemicals, 100 chemicals, and is there an economy of scale?
There definitely would be. Partly we would be more efficient as we learned, and then there would be this other phenomenon whereby the farther down we got, chemicals would get easier to do, and so it would become cheaper per chemical. It'll take a little while to get to that point, but that would certainly happen.
And my final question for you, if the agency got new fee authority provided in the discussion draft, how would you implement it?
It's an interesting question. We have the other part of my operation, which is the pesticides program. We have fee authority, and the way it actually came about, and actually you have some panelists on the next panel who participated in it, is the stakeholders, the NGOs and the industry actually came up with the construct. It gets into very great detail, but that's what they wanted. They wanted a lot of detail with respect to it. Whether you had a scenario where stakeholders developed the fee structure or you gave EPA the authority, if we had the authority, we would get together with the stakeholders to figure out how to do something that was fair and equitable.
Okay. Mr. Jones, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we have other committee hearings going on, so you're going to see us jumping around, and But I want to thank both Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko for holding the hearing today on the updated Chemicals and Commerce Act discussion draft. And I particularly want to thank the Chair and appreciate your patience and leadership in working with us on the drafts. Ultimately, we want to get to a bill, and hopefully we'll get there. But I also want to thank Assistant Administrator Jones and the witnesses on the second panel for joining us. Mr. Jones, I need just some of these are yes or no. If enacted with the discussion draft, the latest one, as written, increase EPA's authority to protect human health and the environment from harmful chemicals over current law? Would the second draft be better than current law?
There are marginal areas of improvement, as particular data gathering authority.
Okay.
So, if generally, that's a yes?
I would
this
say
is important. He asked for
marginally
yes and no.
better
It's
than
important.
Well, what it means, if it's a yes, we're going in the right direction.
You're moving in the right direction.
Okay. Does the discussion draft provide EPA with full and complete authority to obligate companies to provide toxicity data?
Yes.
Okay. The discussion draft actually does that?
Yes.
Okay. Does the discussion draft provide the necessary authorities to protect vulnerable populations such as children, pregnant women, and workers from harmful exposure to toxic chemicals?
It requires us to include them in our safety evaluations.
Okay. Does the EPA currently look at the aggregate exposure of chemicals today in meeting the current safety standard? If not, do you believe that the agency should have that authority to do so?
We have, in the toxics program, we have just started doing chemical assessments and have so far not aggregated all sources of exposure. I think that that's the direction that we need to move in, though.
Okay. Do you know if the discussion draft addresses that?
I don't believe it mandates that we aggregate all exposures, but I will need to confirm that.
Okay. In the discussion draft, would information claimed as confidential business information be allowed as evidence in a court of law?
I can't answer that question. Sorry, Congressman.
Okay. Would amending TSCA so it would have judicial standard review found in the Administrative Procedures Act enhance the law's protection of human health?
The substantial evidence, I believe, is the judicial standard in the discussion draft.
That's in the discussion draft, but if it was changed to be similar to what the Administrative Procedures Act would that enhance the laws or the discussion draft's protection of human health?
And I'm not able to answer that question. I think.
Has the agency ever reconsidered exemptions for chemicals regulated under Section 5 of current TSCA? And if so, what chemicals and what is the status of reconsideration? Has the agency reconsidered exemptions for chemicals under Section 5?
We have added the number of exemptions under Section 5.
Okay. So if chemicals, and can you name those chemicals or give us the status of that reconsideration?
There would be categories of categories that we've included exemptions over time.
Okay.
And we can describe what those categories are.
In your testimony, you state that EPA should have the flexibility to consider, among other things, equity concerns, which, when making a risk management action, could you explain what you mean by equity concerns and why are they important to the to the agency?
So the benefits of decisions aren't always enjoyed equally across society, and just understanding where the benefits fall and where the costs fall, so that we have our eyes wide open when we're making decisions.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, this is the first time I think in a long time I have any time left. Does anybody on our side need another half a minute or so? I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jones, I understand that printed circuit board manufacturers recently met with EPA officials to discuss TSCA reporting obligations on byproducts sent for recycling. Now, the good news is this meeting has been characterized to me by those manufacturers as a constructive step in addressing industry's concerns that TSCA reporting on byproducts is unnecessarily burdensome and complex. So I'd simply like to ask today for your commitment to continue working closely with industry over the next month to determine how reporting on byproducts sent for recycling can be reduced or eliminated.
I think we're going to. I know we are going to continue to have some discussions both inside and with the manufacturers to get this to a better place. I don't think it'll be a place that has absolutely no reporting, but the reporting may fall on a completely different group. That
well, we're looking for common sense, and I appreciate it. That's what I've heard from the industry, so I appreciate that. I fear that if EPA continues to seek information through TSCA, which duplicates reporting under other statutes and therefore is of minimal regulatory value, byproducts manufacturers who currently recycle may choose to landfill that waste in order to avoid the regulatory burden and enforcement liability. You know, we should do all that we can to encourage recycling of those secondary materials, which are often rich in metals and other valuable materials, by establishing sensible and non-overlapping reporting regimens that minimize the burden on industry. It ought to be a business-friendly environment.
I think we can figure out.
I'd very much like to work with you in concert with manufacturers to more closely align TSCA reporting with the goal of supporting byproducts recycling. While I believe this committee is prepared to legislatively remedy this issue, I hope we can all agree that an administrative remedy is the preferred short-term solution. So can I have your commitment to work with the industry and our committee today to determine how this can be resolved as quickly as possible?
Yes, you can.
Well, those were easy questions, weren't they?
They were.
Good deal. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Mr. Gett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Jones, for coming. You know, I have to say that there are members on both sides of the aisle, as you know, who have been working together on trying to find consensus on this bill, and we have been meeting for quite some time, Mr. Green and me and Mr. Tonko and the chairman and others, and we've made a big investment of our time and effort into trying to untie this very complicated knot. But I would agree that time is running short, and I would also agree with what you said, Mr. Administrator, that this latest discussion draft is moving the ball forward a little bit, but I still think we need to have some substantive changes before we get to that sweet spot. And I also agree with the chairman that I think at this point this side of the aisle, my side of the aisle, needs to put some specific language forward. So Mr. Chairman and Mr. Tonko, I look forward to working with both of you so that we can get some language that will help address the concerns that we still have. The one issue I always try to not repeat what everybody else said, and I think but I do have concerns with some of the other issues other members have raised. But something we haven't talked a lot about yet today is Section 14 of the discussion draft, confidential information. Under the current law, if a company designates certain information as confidential business information, the EPA has to shield that information from the public. And because the company's claims don't have to require justification and there's no penalty for overclaiming, virtually everybody agrees there's been a lot of misuse of this provision. Now, in the proposed draft, this trend continues. There's no upfront substantiation required for confidential business information except in the specific identity of a chemical. So this is what I want to ask you about. There's also a new restriction in the latest draft that places on EPA's ability to share the most critical piece of chemical information, health and safety studies. While current law provides that health and safety studies can never be claimed as CBI, the new draft would allow companies to keep secret the identity of chemicals implicated in a health and safety study. So that's what I want to ask you about, Mr. Jones. Isn't it true that the agency's been tightening its policies on CBI in an effort to increase transparency?
That's correct.
And in 2010, didn't the agency issue a policy that it would generally deny confidentiality claims for the chemical identities and health and safety studies?
That's correct.
And so the proposal we're examining today would essentially overturn these 2010 reform efforts. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, would that be consistent with the administration's principles on TSCA reform?
No, it wouldn't.
Now, what is the problem in allowing companies to keep chemical identities secret in health and safety studies?
So although the public would have access to a toxicological study, let's say a study on developmental effects or cancer, reproductive effects, they wouldn't be able to discern what chemical was associated with the effect.
So they wouldn't know what chemicals to avoid, is that
They
right?
wouldn't know what chemicals to avoid.
Right. Now, we heard from others that a generic name for a chemical is sufficient. Now, in your review, has that been the case?
It can be, but it really is a function of how much information is conveyed in the generic name.
Okay. Now, the latest draft attempts to resolve the problems with generic names by introducing a new term, unique identifier, so that the administrator may disclose the maximum amount of information about the chemical structure. Will this get at the problem?
Well, unique identifier is important, but you can have a unique identifier that actually doesn't really tell the public or anyone else about the key element of the structure that they might be concerned about.
Okay. Now, are there cases where the only appropriate unique identifier would be the actual identity of the chemical?
Well, you could just make up a name, and that would be a unique identifier.
I guess so. Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is one issue we can really continue to work on, because I think you're trying to make some effort, but I think we need some more work, and I look forward to continuing to participate in this effort, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Thank her for her questions. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy.
Hey, sir. Whenever I go to a TSCA hearing, my head always ends up being turned around, because it seems as if people are disagreeing on things which should be common ground. So let me kind of see if you can get my head turned on right. And I don't mean this to challenge, I just mean this to whatever. I read on page 36 that, or beginning perhaps section 35, that you're supposed to, the EPA would do a high priority risk evaluation, and among other things, determine the hazard. Hazard being, if you will, by definition, or risk, determine the risk, which is by definition hazard times exposure. Okay. And then once determining that, going over to maybe the next section, section C, there is a method by almost a graduated scale. You can say, listen, it's at high risk, but you're never going to be exposed under these circumstances, so don't worry about it. And you keep on kind of working your way all the way to where there's a total ban. Now that seems the way it should work. Would you agree with that?
That we should be making risk-based determinations, yes.
And that there should be some latitude for EPA to make a determination as to what is the potential exposure. If the potential exposure is nil, it sure may be a great hazard, but exposure is nil, so therefore we're okay with it.
Anything times 0 is 0.
All the way up until, oh my gosh, we just need to totally eradicate this from society.
Correct.
Now, that mechanism is laid out here, and it seems like that's the paradigm we should be employing. Would you agree with that?
I think that the risk evaluation side is laid out that way. When it gets to actually what EPA should do as it relates to regulating, it no longer follows that paradigm, but says the agency should look at the risks, compare them to the benefits, and only if the benefits outweigh the risks should the agency regulate. And then there's some other things.
If the benefit of regulation outweighs the risk.
The health benefits need to outweigh the cost.
So we had something that came up last year, and it's a Clean Water Act bill, but it comes to mind. Where apparently in a previous Congress, lead was not allowed in drinking water except when it involved a bidet, a toilet, or some other device, because the brass fittings there have a little bit of lead, and to have your bidet apparently really sealed tightly. But it didn't allow fire hydrants. And EPA put out a rule that they were not going to allow the use or, I guess, the sale or manufacturing of fire hydrants. Now that's kind of like one of those death of common sense.
Mm-hmm.
But EPA rightly said, this is the statute. It doesn't give us wiggle room. Now, in that case, wouldn't it have been nice to have a risk-benefit analysis that would have said, really, your exposure of drinking water from a fire hydrant are so minimal, et cetera, we can waive this and not require literally an act of Congress in order to preserve it. Is that a fair?
Well, that's why the administration's articulated a view that the standard ought to be risk-based, but we should be able to consider costs, which in the scenario you described would allow you that wiggle room to do something that didn't, on the face of it, sound like it wasn't the smart thing to do, which is very different from actually being able to say, I've monetized the benefits and they numerically outweigh the monetization of the costs, which in a perfect world would make sense, but we rarely have the kind of information that really can lead to accurate decision making in that context.
But how else then do you do it?
If you are able to consider costs in your risk management, you can make choices as to whether or not you think that the costs of achieving the ideal level of safety may be such that you may not want to get to that level of safety, but a little bit below that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Doesn't the presidential executive order require you to do that anyway?
The executive order requires us to do cost-benefit analysis, and we do that even in statutes that have risk-only standards.
So it's not like a crisis of monumental proportions that you do a cost-benefit analysis and then evaluating risk.
No, but it matters in terms of ultimately the judicial review that occurs, which the OMB requirement is irrelevant to the judicial review. It's the statute that governs that.
I yield back to my colleague. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I got all my pages. My staple came off, and my staples are apart. But it did seem as if there was a graduated way in which the EPA would be able to do some sort of cost-benefit analysis, and ultimately in concluding with the total banning of the substance. But I'm hearing from you that you either don't want that authority or that you think you should have the authority. What am I hearing?
We don't think that the decision framework should be that you have to show that the benefits outweigh the costs, as we don't think that the information that we will generally have available allows that balancing to be as accurate as people would hope it would be.
I don't think people are talking about scientific precision. I think they're talking about some sort of weighing of common sense.
Courts have generally found that if you can't show that the actual dollar value of the human health benefits aren't literally bigger than the dollar value.
And I have a little bit one extra question. So, my frustration is obviously this leads to where we're going to ban something, even though it costs $1 million to ban it, and there's only $1 of. If you totally discharge the responsibility for coming up with such a thing, don't want the authority, then you actually come into a situation where there is the death of common sense, where we really need to no longer sell fire hydrants because we can't quantitate the relative exposure. Now, we can't have it both ways. We can't say give you a little bit of wiggle room so that we're not banning fire hydrants, and on the other hand saying, oh my gosh, we don't want that authority because we don't have the ability to pull off the analysis.
Well, it's very different. It's very different from saying I'd like to be able to consider costs, so I don't do something like you just described, versus I have to literally calculate the human health benefits, which are nearly impossible to do most of the time, and I have to show that that number is bigger than the cost, which is usually easily able to calculate, but often overestimated.
Gentlemen, time's far exceeded, and I hope you'll come back for the second panel, which I think we'll have a further discussion on this. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Jones, for your testimony today, for being with us. Many stakeholders have raised concerns about the need to protect vulnerable populations in any modernized TSCA. It's been a point I've made in our previous hearings on this topic. I think it's absolutely essential. If we reform TSCA but fail to adequately protect children, pregnant women, or seniors, we've really failed. As you know, vulnerable populations include infants and children, the elderly, the disabled, the workers, and those living near chemical facilities. In their 2009 report, Science and Decisions, the National Academies of Science recommended that all vulnerable populations should receive special attentions at all stages of the risk assessment process. In its current form, the discussion draft only examines potentially exposed subpopulations when evaluating the risk of existing chemicals, but the draft does not direct the EPA to protect any of these risks when they are identified. It strikes me as a glaring oversight. Mr. Jones, you previously testified that a chemical should not be able to pass the safety standard under a reformed TSCA if it's dangerous to a vulnerable population. But my understanding is that this revised draft does not provide this guarantee. Instead, it uses a cost-benefit standard to direct EPA to balance the health risks to vulnerable subpopulations against the cost to the industry to take protective action. Do you think, is your opinion that this is an accurate statement, or if not, would you correct me?
The only modification I would make is that it's not just the cost to the industry, but any costs to society. But otherwise, I think your characterization is accurate.
Okay. So that means if we enact this proposal, we couldn't tell parents that the law always puts the health of their children first, right?
That's correct.
Does the administration support this approach, or does it think the law should require that children in vulnerable populations are protected from toxic chemicals?
We prefer the latter.
Mr. Chairman, this proposal doesn't make sense to me. For the last 40 years, we've had a law that does not adequately protect children, seniors, and other vulnerable populations. Why would we want to pass another law that simply continues that failed approach? And I yield back.
Lady yields back her time. Seeing no more members present, we want to thank you. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Mr. Bilolakis is now recognized from the state of Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question, does this section of the April discussion draft, sir, improve the agency's ability to require the submission of hazard and exposure data and information by authorizing EPA to obtain it by rule, consent agreement, or issuing an order?
Section 4 does that, yes.
Say that again.
Section 4 does that, yes.
Very good. Does the expansion of testing authority to cover the chemical prioritization process provide the agency sufficient flexibility to obtain additional information necessary to make decisions and priorities?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll go back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman,
Mr. Chair.
For what purposes, gentlemen, ask recognition?
Right. If I might, you've mentioned a number of times that you would like to see language from our side of the aisle. There seems to be an implication that somehow we've refused to engage in the process. I just want to clarify the record. After you released your discussion draft in March, our staff sat down on a bipartisan basis to discuss it. Our staff identified 12 areas where we needed to have further discussion in order to reach a bipartisan agreement. Staff discussed these issues. With many of the issues, your staff informed our staff that changes would not be possible. In other cases, I'm told your staff expressed some receptivity, but they did not want to work out language with us. Our staff offered to go to Legislative Council with your staff to work together on the text, but that offer was refused. So if this is a misunderstanding, and you'd like our staff to work out language together, I'd suggest we direct them to do so. We're happy to engage, and I hope there is sufficient flexibility to address the stakeholders' concerns.
If the gentleman would yield.
I will yield.
Yeah, this has been an interesting process for me in that we've worked diligently with members, with staff, with full committee staff, sometimes with individual staff at other times. We continue to have asked for language. We have not received language. We can go through this process of junior high, he said what to who, and who's talking to who, and why aren't they doing this to the other person. I'm telling you, it's a tad frustrating. All we're trying to do is drop a draft of a bill. We've accepted language. We've moved the process forward. We want to continue to do that. We hope that you will work with us in that process. But there is a time when members need to talk to members. And with all due respect to our staff, who are very, very smart, if there is a problem with this process, then you can walk down the hall. You can pick up the phone. We can meet with our staff together, which we have done with some members. So we're moving forward. We appreciate the help and support. And if there's been frustration, it's just this is a very difficult process. Many of us are not lawyers, and this thing has not been revised since I was in high school. We can do better, and that's all we're trying to do.
Right, and all I'm asking is that if there's a request to have us sit down and work out language, let's come to the table together and get that done. This is much more serious than junior high. And if the request for language is made. Let's come to the table, to the common table. They did not, as I'm told, there was not a receptivity to work out language with us, and I'm just asking that we come to the table, get that done, because time is fleeting.
All I've said, I've asked for language for 2 months from the minority staff and have not received any language.
Okay,
So
we're told that that was not the case, so let's meet at the table and produce the language.
That is the case, and I want to again thank Mr. Jones for his time. This is a difficult process. We appreciate your testimony, long, and you can see the members were well prepared by directed comments directly to the draft bill. We appreciate your forthright answers. We know it's not done, it's not perfect. We encourage you and ask you to continue to be involved and engaged in this process, because we can get to a better product by working together. So with that, we'd like to dismiss you, and we'd like to ask for the second panel to sit down. I think we're going to hire Mr. Dooley to be a good staffer. He knows the ropes. If we get the door closed, we want to thank you. Hopefully you found the first panel interesting, educational, enlightening, and we do appreciate you coming for this second panel. In the sake of time, we want to continue to go forward. I will introduce everybody first and then call you individually for your opening statements. I think that's, for me, the most expeditious way of, from my left to right. We're joined by the Honorable Cal Dooley, President and CEO of American Chemistry Council, former colleague, great friend, and we appreciate you being here. Dr. Beth Bosley, President, Bourne Specialties, on behalf of the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates. Again, thank you for being here. Mr. Mark Greenwood, Principal, Greenwood Environmental Council. Sir, welcome. You've testified before, so good to see you again. Dr. Len Sawyers, Vice President, Global Sustainability for Procter & Gamble Company. Again, another familiar face. Mr. Stephen Goldberg, Vice President, Associate General Counsel, Regulatory Government Affairs for BASF. You've also been here before. Mr. Andrew Egregious. Oh, you're over there. Okay, we got our things mixed up. National Campaign Director, Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, another familiar face, and the Honorable Michael Moore on behalf of the National Conference of State Legislators. Sir, welcome. So we'll start with Mr. Dooley. Your full statement's in the record. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the latest draft of the Chemicals in Commerce Act. ACC greatly appreciates the time and effort that you and your staff have devoted to this critical issue, and we believe this draft addresses key issues and questions that have been raised by a variety of stakeholders, and questions have been raised by a number of members of this committee at the February 27th hearing on the previous draft. You know, I think if you look at some of the modifications in this draft, they responded to some of the concerns that Member Tonko offered about the preemption of state laws. This draft provides for a robust national chemical regulatory program while also maintaining the abilities of states to protect their citizens when EPA has not acted. Unlike the earlier draft, a low-priority designation of a chemical by EPA will no longer preempt existing state laws. Only a final EPA decision after a risk evaluation of a high-priority chemical will preempt a state regulation or law. And Congressman DeGette, you asked about EPA's testing authority. This draft greatly strengthens EPA's ability to demand more data by allowing EPA to demand further testing for purposes of prioritization, and this is also a major change from the earlier version. Our colleague Congressman Green asked about TSCA's safety standards should be based solely on health and exposure, and this draft clarifies that only hazard, use, and exposure considerations may be applied to determine the risk associated with an intended use of chemical. Cost-benefit considerations are only considered in the risk management phase of the regulation. And Congressman Capps, who has a great concern about vulnerable subpopulations, this draft explicitly requires EPA to consider exposure to infants, children, pregnant women, workers, and the elderly during the prioritization process and throughout the risk evaluations. And Congressman Pallone has asked about TSCA's current requirement to apply the least burdensome option. He mentioned that in his questions earlier today. This draft eliminates the least burdensome requirements, enhancing EPA's ability to efficiently and effectively impose regulations on chemicals. This legislation, or draft legislation, provides a national approach to ensure the safety of chemicals in commerce. It empowers EPA to evaluate the risks associated with the exposure to a chemical, to determine if the cost or the risk of exposure can be safely managed, and to also assess whether the costs and benefits of the restrictions on the use of a chemical are in the interest of consumers. I think it's instructive to see how the CICA could apply to the use of this fluorescent CFL fluorescent light bulb. This light bulb uses about a quarter of the energy and lasts about 10 times as long as a traditional light bulb. But widespread adoption of these CFLs are helping to reduce energy demand, reduce carbon emissions, and are reducing energy costs for consumers. But there is a small amount of mercury that is required to make these highly efficient bulbs effective. Under CICA, EPA would certainly find mercury to be a high priority chemical based on hazard. EPA then would conduct a risk evaluation as to determine whether mercury used in this CFL posed a significant risk. Finding that, EPA would next consider whether the exposure to mercury in this bulb could be managed to protect against an unreasonable risk of harm to human health and the environment. In EPA's development of regulations on the use of mercury in this bulb, they would consider the costs and benefits of allowing mercury to be used and whether there were alternatives. This approach is compelling from a public policy perspective, as EPA would be ensuring the risk of exposure to mercury was acceptable in this bulb while encouraging the development of a product that has significant societal and environmental benefits. This example of the CFL bulb also demonstrates why preemption provisions of CICA are sound public policy. Unfortunately, many state regulatory programs are based solely on whether a chemical can cause harm in any circumstance. This means that if the state, my home state of California, decided to impose a blanket ban on the use of mercury, CFLs could not be sold there. This would have a significant negative consequences as innovators and companies throughout the country would be reluctant to invest in the development and manufacture of advanced products such as this bulb if it was banned in what is the 5th largest economy in the world. The current draft of the Chemicals and Commerce Act is a positive contribution to reforming TSCA, and we believe it provides a roadmap to legislation that the American Chemistry Council can strongly support.
Thank you. Your time has expired. Chair now recognizes Dr. Bosley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be back in Washington to share my perspective as a small business owner and on behalf of the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates regarding the April 18th discussion draft of the Chemicals and Commerce Act. You and your staffs have been doing great work on TSCA reform, and SOCMA very much appreciates it. I'd particularly like to thank you for recognizing that TSCA is as much about products as it is about health and the environment. It's an important interrelationship. We need to protect against unreasonable risks, but we also need to be able to keep making the products that make every other aspect of our society useful. As we work towards strengthening EPA's authority to regulate industrial chemicals, we must be careful that it does not come at the expense of innovation. This is how we create and sustain jobs. It's also how we can develop greener chemicals and bolster public confidence. You've attained positive approaches from the February 27th draft on issues that matter most to SACMA. You've also made additional improvements in several other areas. There are some aspects of the current draft that concern us, and we'd like some clarification on those. Regarding new chemicals and CBI, timely approval of new chemicals and reliable protection of trade secrets are SACMA's two top priorities. Because they are critical to facilitating innovation, and the draft makes some changes to new chemicals and confidential business information provisions of the bill, but these two sections continue to be very, very workable. As you continue to deliberate these sections, consider that new chemicals do tend to be greener. Note also that if a manufacturer does not have test data, EPA will continue to use precautionary approaches involving potential exposures, modeling tools, and data on analog chemicals before a chemical ever reaches commerce. If the agency then still feels like it needs measured data, it can request it and often does. Finally, companies regularly continue to test chemicals even after EPA approves them. Regarding existing chemicals, the new draft contains additional requirement for EPA to review available information on a chemical, including any screening level information, before requiring testing. We support this change. It only makes sense that EPA leverage all the available data and information before pursuing potentially burdensome testing regimens. Prioritization. Relatedly, the prioritization process in the bill now allows EPA to require development of additional data to determine whether a substance falls into a high priority bucket in cases where existing information is insufficient. This is a great improvement. We also believe that enhanced processor reporting is an important aspect of any new bill. In the same way EPA can seek additional toxicity data to prioritize a chemical, we'd like to see language specifically authorizing EPA to require processors to report use and exposure data for particular product categories, especially where commercial or consumer uses can be significant. We understand this is a challenging issue, but is essential to well-informed risk evaluations. As I've mentioned in prior testimony, the bill should also expand TSCA Section 8E to authorize submission of non-adverse data and to require EPA to take that data into account when prioritizing and evaluating chemicals. Presently, Section E is biased toward only adverse data because that's all that we can submit. Such an enhancement would greatly increase the amount of data submitted under this authority, which can only improve EPA's understanding of chemical hazards. Regarding deadlines, SACMA has called for a mandate for EPA to remove a minimum number of chemicals or some percentage of chemicals over time in order to ensure that it will act more expeditiously on existing chemicals than it has thus far. While the bill does not yet do that, it does include deadlines for reviewing existing chemicals. I think the deadlines may be too generous in aggregate. It would give EPA a total of up to 10 years from release of a high priority determination to issue a final rule imposing risk management requirements or restriction. I think 4 years for the risk evaluation is probably too long. Something like 18 to 24 months should be workable. We notice that the phrase in Section 6 and 9 is significant risk, and we look forward to understanding your intent here. I think it's probably an improvement over unreasonable risk. Risk management now. This bill clearly separates risk evaluation and risk management steps, and it makes even clearer the former is purely a health-based standard. We think this is good and still leaves the bill with fewer steps than in the Senate bill. As for the risk management process, we support the bill's requirement that restrictions of chemicals be cost-effective. However, we are concerned that the bill would allow EPA to ban a chemical even when it concludes there is no technically or economically feasible, safer alternative. The draft drops the definition of best available science, and the concept contains there, and they don't appear elsewhere in the bill. We're disappointed by this because the credibility of EPA risk evaluations will depend on the strength of the science supporting them. We're pleased to see that the bill did retain language on good science and the requirement that EPA evaluate chemicals by weight of evidence. I would think both sides of the aisle would agree that would only defeat our common goal of enhancing public confidence if EPA could be accused of cherry-picking data or methods. In conclusion, the bill represents an improvement over the status quo and shows continued promise for a bipartisan solution. We appreciate your intense focus on TSCA reauthorization and remain committed to helping in any way we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greenwood. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Mark Greenwood. I'm an environmental lawyer. I've been working on TSCA for over 25 years. As part of that, I was the chief lawyer for the TSCA program from 1988 to 1990. I was director of the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics from 1990 to 94 and advised clients on these issues for over 20 years. What I would like to do today is offer some comments on the strengths of this bill in the context of some of the historical issues that have occurred in the TSCA program. And I really would like to respond to something that I think is a fairly puzzling characterization I've heard, that somehow this discussion draft is worse than the current law. And just as kind of a reality check on that, I thought I would reflect back on 1990 when I started as an office director at EPA, and if they could have given me a choice between the law that was there on the books, which by the way is the law we have today, and this discussion draft, which would I have preferred to do the best job I could to protect the American people from chemical risk? I found it very easy. I would select the discussion draft. It has in it key elements that will increase the protection and the ability of EPA to act in ways that I think are extremely important. I've documented those in my written testimony. I'll highlight just a couple points in the interest of brevity. For Section 6, which we know is the centerpiece of the existing chemical program, as others have mentioned, your draft removes the least burdensome requirement provision. That was the most difficult problem that came out of the asbestos corrosion-proof fitting decision. You've removed it. It removes the specter of that decision from the program. A second one that's very important is prioritization. One of the curses of TSCA is that it has always been the statute, particularly in Section 6, that can do anything but has a mandate to do nothing. And that has been a problem institutionally. EPA and the TSCA program has always had a problem getting more resources for the program. It's had a problem getting its regulations through the review process. We often saw the phenomenon, which I experienced several times, when new political leaders would come into EPA, they'd look at this wonderful new tool and say, this can be used for this special project. And that special project then disappeared when they left, and the career people at EPA were left with another failed project. I think what happens with this prioritization system is it creates a system that legitimizes the establishment of a long-term agenda for this program, which it desperately needs, and allows the program to have a sustained effort to implement that agenda. The third thing, which I think you've added, which is an improvement over other drafts, is this distinction in the safety standard / now risk evaluation and risk management provisions to distinguish what you call a significant risk and an unreasonable risk. And what's important there is probably less the specific words of the standard than the fact that you articulate the considerations that go into that decision, and they are very distinct. So you do have a significant risk decision that looks solely at health and environmental factors and explicitly says that costs and benefits are not part of that decision, and I think you heard Jim Jones recognize that that is an important change. Similarly, in the risk management area, you have tried to clarify what factors should be considered. Previously, there were some overlapping factors that you've taken out. I think it's a big improvement. The second area I want to address is actually confidential business information, which has often been identified as a systematic problem with TSCA. Now, this perception, I think, unfortunately, can be traced back to some events that occurred during my tenure at EPA. Back in 1990, we decided to create a new strategy for the program in which we tried to, as we said, go public with the information that we had about health and environmental risks of chemicals. It was very much aligned with, at that time, with the public right to know programs. We were in charge of the toxic release inventory, and we thought that was a good thing to do. Now, in going out and doing this, I'm afraid we kind of stirred a rather serious debate. And we have had a debate on CBI reforms and CBI changes, which have gone on for many years. It was not productive. It was very polarized. The debate was not very well explained. However, a group of people working on this bill in the Senate and in the House have come together. NGO groups were involved. Industry was involved to come up with some common sense reforms, which I think as a package have really advanced this. this debate, and I think can resolve a lot of the issues that have plagued the program for over 20 years. So in a sense, you had a guerrilla war for the last 20 years on this topic, and you have the ability in enacting this to perhaps ratify the TSCA CBI Treaty of 2014 and resolve this war. And that has got to be a success story in any case. Thank you for your comment.
I thank you. And now I'd like to recognize Dr. Sowers for 5 minutes.
Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Len Sowers. I'm Vice President of Global Sustainability, Product Safety, and Regulatory Affairs at the Procter & Gamble Company. P&G is the largest consumer products company in the world, and our products are used by more than 4.8 billion people worldwide. 99% of American households contain at least one P&G product. Since our founding in 1837, innovation has been integral to everything we do and critical to our success. At P&G, we believe innovation is our lifeblood. I congratulate and thank the subcommittee for continued bipartisan collaboration to further refine and improve the draft legislation. We firmly believe that any legislative effort to modernize TSCA must have a strong foundation built on common ground from a broad range of stakeholder interests. The time for action is now. A strong and effective federal chemical management program will lessen pressure on states or markets to independently take action to regulate chemicals. Enhancing consumer confidence is P&G's single most important objective for modernizing TSCA. We recognize and hear from our consumers that they are concerned about chemicals used in everyday products. We believe a modernized TSCA will strengthen public confidence in EPA's oversight of the safety of chemicals used in the everyday products that consumers bring into their homes and use around their families. The latest discussion draft makes some very important improvements over the current statute. For example, CICA requires EPA to identify and account for active chemicals in U.S. commerce and then apply transparent criteria to prioritize them. CICA instructs EPA to conduct a risk evaluation of high-priority chemicals to examine their probable or demonstrated harm to humans or the environment, with attention given to the most vulnerable subpopulations potentially exposed by these priority chemicals. CICA expressly prohibits EPA from considering economic costs and benefits in the risk evaluation for priority chemicals, which is a noted improvement over the earlier discussion draft, and acknowledges the common ground reached by industry and NGO stakeholders that a new safety standard in a modernized TSCA should be health-based only. EPA's subsequent regulatory actions must impose requirements or restrictions that sufficiently and effectively manage the risk while carefully evaluating practical considerations to ensure market benefit and continuity. And importantly, CICI offers new authority for EPA to collect additional information on chemicals in commerce when such information is most useful to the agency in decision-making. Another important element of the proposed CICA Act is support for innovation through protection of confidential business information. Procter & Gamble invests $2 billion annually in research and development. It's 60% more than our next closest competitor and more than most of our competitors combined. Once we bring new products to market, we have significant interest in protecting our confidential business information from public disclosure to our competitors. Appropriate protections for confidential information allow innovative companies to succeed and for P&G to earn our consumers' trust and loyalty. We rely heavily on the protection of confidential business information afforded by Section 14 of TSCA to remain competitive. We recognize that EPA has to carefully balance the protection of confidential business information under TSCA with providing public access to health and safety information. P&G fully supports transparency with health and safety information and the disclosure of confidential information to states and medical professionals to assist with the diagnosis and treatment of illnesses. The discussion draft appropriately authorizes EPA to disclose such information. We also strongly support provisions to the discussion draft that provide adequate protection for confidential chemical identities, even when associated with a health and safety study. A specific confidential chemical identity is not needed to conduct a health and safety study, interpret its results, or communicate the study's observed health effects and conclusion. Structurally descriptive, generic chemical names are sufficient to provide the public with information about the structure of the chemical and its hazard profile, which in turn provides a linkage and access to publicly available scientific and toxicological literature on structurally related materials. In our industry, confidential chemical entities are often the most valuable type of intellectual property. Disclosure of a specific confidential chemical entity can provide watchful competitors with clues needed to replicate our product formulations. P&G agrees with other industry stakeholders that CBI protection must be properly substantiated at the time of the initial claim and upon EPA request to renew or extend the duration of protection. We support the CICA provisions that address the need for upfront substantiation of CBI claims for confidential chemical identities and encourage the authors to consider broadening the requirement. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tonko, thank you again for the invitation to testify this morning. We believe the time to modernize TSCA is now.
Thank you. Now, Chair now recognizes Mr. Goldberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus.
I think there should be a button for that.
There we go. Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity. I'm Steve Goldberg, Vice President and Associate General Counsel for Regulatory and Government Affairs at BASF Corporation. BASF Corporation is the North American arm of BASF Group, which is the world's largest chemical company. BASF Corporation supports modernization of TSCA. We believe substantial progress has been made towards that goal by the most recent draft of the Chemicals and Commerce Act. And we appreciate the subcommittee's focus on this important matter and are grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today. A number of key principles and concepts for TSCA modernization are the subject of agreement among a wide variety of stakeholders, including the fact that TSCA should provide for additional authority for EPA to review and manage risks from existing chemicals on the market, as it has successfully done for new chemicals since TSCA's inception. A prioritization process is an appropriate way for EPA to commence reviewing existing chemicals in order to ensure its resources are spent in the most efficient way. EPA requires additional authority to call for testing of chemicals where existing data is insufficient to permit reasoned conclusions either as to priority status or to make risk assessments. And the appropriate approach for a safety assessment of chemicals is a risk-based standard, that is, one that takes into account not just hazards, but also exposure and use in order to lead to safety conclusions. And while I'm not testifying on their behalf today, while I participate in the chemical management teams at American Chemistry Council, I also do so at the leading downstream associations, the American Cleaning Institute, Consumer Specialty Products Association, and those associations are committed to participate in this process to provide appropriate use data so that the standard can be risk-based, not just hazard-based. The benefit and cost considerations are not appropriate when making a safety assessment, but are critical in deciding the appropriateness of risk management measures. As discussed, there should be appropriate protections for CBI. And finally, EPA will require sufficient resources to be able to fulfill its mandate in a timely manner under a modernized TSCA. While provisions in the proposed bill on use exposure data and resource needs require some fleshing out, overall we are pleased that the updated CICA is directed towards meeting these principles and is a substantial improvement over current law. While all these subjects are important, I want to focus on the subject raised by Mr. Dingell, and that is the issue of resources. Ultimately, one key to success of a modernized TSCA is ensuring that EPA has the resources to do its job, and there was extensive discussion about how many chemicals it could review and what sort of time period. Ultimately, a program that provides EPA the authority but not the resources to do that job is a losing proposition for the chemical industry, our customers, and the public. And so the program posited by the CICA clearly will require additional resources in EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics to allow this program to work. Having been extensively involved in development and implementation of the pesticide fee system under the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, which has been in place at EPA for about 10 years, I can provide some perspective on the possible application of a fees approach as part of increasing the resources for EPA to meet the needs of the program. And those fee provisions generally revolve around a number of, again, commonly held principles. That is, fees charged must be dedicated to the program itself, not to the general treasury or other programs within EPA, and those fees generally should go for adding FTEs within EPA. Fees need to supplement, not replace, appropriations for the functions of chemical safety review. They need to be reasonable in amount, and such that will not stifle innovation, which is critical to our industry. A fee should be focused on activities that provide a direct benefit to the person being charged. A fee system needs to take into account small business considerations. And lastly, the agency needs to be accountable and transparent about how those fees are being used. Ultimately, while PREA provides some direction for possible approaches towards meeting resource needs in the chemicals area, it's a somewhat imperfect model. It's a different type of statute. It's a product registration statute instead of a substance statute. As more fully noted in my written testimony, however, there are some models, I think, that will help. So while there are things to be learned from the experience with PREA, ultimately a fee program for chemicals needs to be based on the unique processes called for in TSCA and under the CICA and requirements of a chemical management system. Industry is prepared to discuss the need for additional fees in this particular context if it meets those principles I enunciated, and BSF stands ready to help inform Congress's consideration of the resource needs of the agency, including appropriate fee approaches. And we thank you very much for your consideration.
I thank you for attending. And the business community obviously represents their customers. It's great to have a state senator here who has constituents. I think there's obviously members who are legislators also have great respect for anyone who puts their hat in the ring and runs for political office. So I'd like to recognize Senator Michael Moore from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here today. Chairman Simkis and Ranking Member Tonko and distinguished members of the subcommittee. As a member of the Massachusetts State Senate and a member of the National Conference of State Legislators, I speak today on behalf of the NCSL, a bipartisan organization representing 50 state legislatures and the legislatures of our nation's commonwealths, territories, and the District of Columbia. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Mr. Chairman, while the NCSL encourages Congress to reform and modernize TSCA, we must insist that any changes do not eliminate states' abilities to protect the health and safety of their citizens through sweeping federal preemption. CICA preempts nearly 40 years of state policy in an attempt to provide a one-size-fits-all approach to toxic chemicals regulation. To strip states' residents of protections enacted by their elected officials would be a serious breach of state sovereignty and would leave everyone more susceptible to increased harm from toxic chemicals. CICI would essentially eliminate the ability of state policymakers to regulate toxic chemicals at the state level by divesting all authority away from states and localities and placing this authority solely with the EPA administrator. This approach may have adverse effects on state regulatory structures, which I detailed in my written testimony. CICA may also have unintended and adverse consequences that extend into the other areas of state environmental regulation. Air and water quality in states like New York may suffer because of current language does not explicitly exempt state pollution laws. In the absence of federal action to address issues related to TSCA's lack of revision, half of the states, including the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, have enacted legislation to regulate individual chemicals. Nearly one-third of states, including Massachusetts, have developed comprehensive state chemical regulations. The CICA would preempt all of these laws. I have attached a chart detailing the laws adversely impacted by CICA with my written testimony. Throughout my career in public service, I have seen the benefits of complementary state and federal chemical policy firsthand. As a state environmental police officer, I worked under the Office of the State Attorney General's Environmental Strike Force to investigate crimes associated with illegal chemical practices. The state plays a vital enforcement role in chemical incidents as the primary investigatory authority in these matters, often coordinating with several federal and state organizations to ensure a safe and efficient response. For 18 years, I investigated serious violations of state law that had significant impacts on local communities. In 1993, I was involved with a case in which a metal manufacturing plant failed to use standard procedures when disposing of residual sodium, resulting in an explosion. Beyond these basic failures, firefighters responding to the blaze were significantly injured due to inexcusable mistakes. This included a failure to warn responding officers about the current state of the involved chemical, which explodes upon contact with water. When firefighters began routine containment procedures, a larger explosion occurred and several were critically burned through their protective gear by the reacting chemical. Through the Attorney General's strike force, Massachusetts was able to hold the responsible party accountable, and bring justice to those injured in the incident. Without state participation, enforcement of a chemical policy would be nearly impossible, but current CICA language would drastically hinder state enforcement. By eliminating state ability to enforce laws that are comparable to the federal standards, the responsibility of holding violators responsible would fall primarily on the federal government. States embrace the opportunity to provide an improved safety for their residents and the environment and accept this burden. But preemption language in CICA significantly endangers that enforcement ability. When I became a state legislator, it became more apparent how intricately states must be involved in chemical policy. The TSCA has not been updated for nearly 40 years, and states have acted to pass laws that complement the federal policy. All of these state laws were passed with the welfare of the public in mind. Beyond the host of Massachusetts law that provides increased protection from toxic chemicals, several communities in my district are currently experiencing difficulties and costs associated with federal preemption of railroad operations at rail yards. I commend the subcommittee for their commitment to businesses and interstate commerce in this draft and understand the motivations for a uniform federal chemical policy to promote these goals. However, the advancements of these ideas cannot come at the expense of public and environmental safety. I share the residents' belief that that live near this site to the potential problems of spills entitles them to a measure of involvement in ensuring chemical safety. When 100 gallons of a chemical called styrene used in the manufacturing of styrofoam were spilled in one of these preempted yards, a cooperative effort of rail yard employees and workers from state and municipal agencies were responsible for the cleanup. The incident was handled safely and professionally by all involved parties with only minor complaints of irritated eyes and lingering smells. However, if a rail yard is federally preempted from state law and chemicals being transported are preempted, the citizens of these communities have no recourse to protect their homes and families from future spills. There must be a balance struck between the benefits of interstate commerce and the need for public safety. State legislatures have and must continue to play a role in chemical policy in order to reach that balance. The NCSL encourages Congress to reform and modernize TSCA, but does not believe that the CICA adequately accomplishes this goal. At a minimum, the NCSL believes proposed TSCA reform legislation should embody the elements outlined in the NCSL's Federal Chemical Policy Reform Directive, which is attached to my written testimony. Most notably, any reform of TSCA should preserve state rights to manage chemicals and resources and should be provided for the state level implementation. And I thank you for this opportunity and look forward to any questions.
Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Egregious for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families is a nonpartisan coalition of health, environmental, labor organizations, and businesses. We came together to do TSCA reform in a meaningful way, and we remain committed to that. I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I especially appreciate the process you followed of having discussion drafts before going forward with a formal bill, and want to use the opportunity to encourage a different course before you do that. We took this very seriously. We had a team of experts review the new draft, and we did note improvements, so I want to point them out so you don't have to do it for me. The testing authority is an improvement. The getting rid of the best available science definitions, the definitions of adequate information, et cetera. But we were still unanimous in our analysis that the improvements don't alter the bottom line, which is that when you take the ambitious preemption in the bill, the sweeping preemption, with the things that roll back pieces of federal law, and then the fact that the things that I believe you intend as improvements in the bill are still not there in our analysis, the net effect is to go backward. That's our analysis of the bill still. The first question we asked ourselves, will the EPA be able to impose restrictions on unsafe chemicals under the bill? And we came to the same conclusion that Jim did, that even though you have separated the assessment from the decision on risk management, the bottom line there is still that EPA has to prove something too much like what it has to prove now, which has been shown to be unworkable, in order to impose the restrictions needed to ensure safety. And I hope you'll agree that's a threshold issue that we have to solve, and I think we want people outside of the chemical industry concurring that it has been solved before we go forward. The second question is, does the bill establish a clear idea of safety that we can all be sure will protect pregnant women and children? And I think our answer again was no. I did want to credit that the assessment is now clearly health-based, and there's a foothold for some key concepts like vulnerable populations, aggregate exposure, et cetera. But they're not lined up in a way that assures the protection for pregnant women and children. And this term significant risk, which may turn out to be an improvement or something that we can work with, it's still unclear what that means, and we want to make sure it's clear. The third question was, does it improve or diminish the oversight of new chemicals? And this is where we're still perplexed overall that our position, I think most people's sense is that new chemicals should be made to be safe, shown to be safe before they get on the market. That's the administration's principles. It's how a lot of people, when they first get into this issue, they think chemicals work like drugs, and they're surprised that it doesn't work that way, and they think it should work that way. But we were surprised, and the chemical industry has always said the new chemicals program as it is works fine. But we do see some rollbacks in that authority here. They have limited authority to and criteria whereby they can order development information, impose some risk management, and the new draft restores one of those, but still takes back a couple of those pieces of authority. We'd like to see that removed. We also asked, will this increase the transparency and public confidence, which is a goal that's been, you've enunciated, the industry has enunciated, and our answer was no again. I think the draft adds a layer of murkiness, and this has come up. For the first time, you explicitly allow the delinking, or require really, the delinking of a chemical from a health and safety study, the chemical identity from a health and safety study that might implicate it as having health concerns. And that really does mean you could have a secret carcinogen on the inventory. It'll be very hard for the public to track, is this being managed well? And I think the idea of public confidence is that when chemicals do have problems, we can see how they're being managed. And so that's going to be something that will undermine transparency. The low priority designation, if it worked the way it was referenced by one of the members, I forget if it was Mr. Latta, that it was just an ordering, it's what EPA is going to get to later, but because of the remaining link to preemption here, that it's not just EPA saying we're not going to look at this now, but we're going to prohibit states from looking at it in the future, all on the basis of this likely to be safe, as opposed to that they found it to be safe. I think that will be interpreted by many in industry as basically a hall pass, that people will want that. This is sort of a promise this chemical will never get looked at. And the first time something bad ends up somewhere that we don't want it, we're going to have a scandal, and the credibility of the whole program, I think, and what the safety means will come down. The preemption has been discussed in some detail. We agree with the comments that it is sweeping and overly ambitious. And so we would urge a different approach in the bill. I've engaged in a lot of dialogue with people in industry on a lot of these issues. Part of our reaction is that we don't see a lot of what I had seen as ideas that have come out with for more common ground approaches reflected in these drafts. And perhaps it's time to focus in on some key issues, and I think those would be, is there a definition of safety that we can all understand and get behind, and not just my coalition, but the folks in the medical community, the pediatricians, others that have weighed in on that subject? Is there clear authority that everyone agrees EPA would have to impose conditions needed to ensure safety? Is there a schedule and resources that we know are making meaningful progress at the federal level? And maybe that would be, good for government work right there. Some real progress, but nothing that goes backwards. That's what we'd be looking for. So I'd encourage that approach, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much.
Appreciate your testimony. Again, we welcome all our panelists, and I recognize myself for the first 5 minutes for questions. I guess I'd like to start with there was this cost-benefit analysis that Mr. Jones had testified briefly on in that whole discussion near the end of the first panel, and offer anyone a chance to make a comment on it. Mr. Greenwood, you look like you're ready to do that.
Well, one of the things actually I mentioned in my testimony was when you talk about cost-benefit analysis and this unreasonable risk standard and what it means, I think it's useful to consider the fact that just a month ago, EPA proposed a new rule. This is under the FIFRA statute for pesticides, but it is under an unreasonable adverse effects on the environment standard, very similar to the unreasonable risk standard. Proposed a set of very protective new standards for farm workers, and explicitly indicated that this is to deal with some very serious effects on farm workers, their families, to address the issues of environmental justice, and articulated this as part of the unreasonable risk standard. These are legitimate qualitative factors to consider. There was a cost-benefit analysis done Interestingly enough, the cost-benefit analysis showed that if you purely look at the monetized costs and benefits, actually the cost exceeded the monetized benefits. However, the government decided that because of the qualitative benefits, which can be considered in cost-benefit analysis, this was a justified rule, and it was a rule that met the unreasonable risk standard. So I think we have to be very careful, assuming that the mere existence of a cost-benefit analysis or unreasonable risk necessarily leads to a less protective set of standards.
Mr. Dooley.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that, and I use the example of the mercury in the light bulb. You know, if you didn't have a cost-benefit analysis that considered, you know, the societal benefits, the environmental benefits, you could well have this product never brought to market. And I, you know, find it a little bit frustrating with Mr. Jones' testimony is that when he cited the EPA's principles, and even in his written testimony, he makes a very clear statement that for when chemicals do not meet the safety standard, they need to have the flexibility to consider children's health, economic costs, social benefits, and equity concerns. They are saying that you need a cost-benefit analysis. That is consistent with President Clinton's executive order, it's consistent with President Obama's executive order, and it's consistent with the language in your discussion draft on page 45, which states, determine whether technically and economically feasible alternatives that benefit human health or the environment compared to the use proposed to be prohibited or substantially prevented will be reasonably available. This comment that Mr. Jones said that you have to weigh one alternative or another is not embodied in the draft legislation that you have presented to this committee.
Thank you. Let me move on. I'll never get through all the questions. But for the Senator, does this bill, and CERCLA is our Superfund federal legislation, CERCLA and Superfund are two federal pieces of legislation. Does this bill exempt any of CERCLA and Superfund from regulation? Because why I say that is in your comments about spills, that's all under CERCLA and that's all under Superfund and remediation and the like. So my point is those things aren't going to be exempted under this piece of legislation, and it's an apples and oranges comparison, and I just wanted to...
That comparison, maybe I'd have to go back and research whether the Superfund and CERCLA is, but actually as like my panelists, fellow panelists up here just presented the fluorescent light, Massachusetts actually just passed a recent mercury ban. So the question is in Massachusetts with this...
Yeah, so no fluorescent light bulbs in Massachusetts?
Well, no, we have fluorescent light bulbs.
But there's mercury in there.
But there's a mercury ban that's been in place, and the Massachusetts law regarding the mercury ban would actually be preempted. So that's a law that Massachusetts actually passed. Okay, preempted.
Okay. Thanks. Now I've lost all control over the direction I was going to go. Let me move to Mr. Greenwood. Some of the people involved in this debate have strong feelings about federal preemption. We just started talking about that. Why is it important to address preemption, and do you think the discussion draft takes the right task?
Well, I think it's very important to address preemption, but I would say it in the following way. It's important because I think it's an increasingly important issue that needs to be teed up actually for international purposes. And here's the context. Obviously, in the United States, we get nervous about anything that goes to preemption because it goes to key principles of the history of our country. But in the world of chemical management across the world today, we are facing a series of different kinds of controls from other parts of the world. We want to have, at some point, some kind of consistency of standards across borders, obviously within the country, but more and more the threat of making that very hard to do is the fact that we have countries around the world with their own chemical programs. In the case of Europe, we've got a set of standards in REACH that cover a continent. And if you are going to try to advance the interests of the United States and engage with the other parts of the world as your trading partners, you have to have a consistent position. The ticket for entry in that discussion is one country, one voice. You have to be able to say, we are here as the United States with our position in dealing with other countries and with European community. And our trading partners don't not want to negotiate with the individual states in the United States. They're expecting the federal government to speak for the country. So at some point, one of the things that needs to be considered here is how preemption or other mechanisms that try to get people, the state regulators and the federal regulators, on the same page for purposes of these discussions will factor into how TSCA is designed.
Yeah, and I appreciate my time's far expired. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Tonko, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier, EPA told us that the discussion draft fails to address some key elements of meaningful chemical safety reform and in some ways weakens current federal law. That alone should give us pause. But the bill also includes sweeping preemption of state and local laws. Essentially, the bill completely ties the hands of state and local regulators to protect human health and the environment from toxic chemicals in commerce. Senator Moore, I'd like to explore the potential impacts of this preemption language with you. In your testimony, you mentioned that the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, has passed several toxics use reduction laws, including a comprehensive chemicals management program requiring companies to develop a plan for pollution prevention. Why did Massachusetts develop this program, and were the federal programs inadequate?
Well, obviously, in Massachusetts, we're looking at the needs of we determine to be the needs of our Commonwealth, and what we determine are going to protect the welfare and the safety of our citizens and protect the environment. So we're looking at our state and how we think we should move forward in a comprehensive process of addressing chemical use.
So does that suggest that the federal programs were inadequate?
I don't want to say inadequate, but I think everyone can admit that the EPA is, with the amount of work that they have to do, they're overtasked. There's a lot of responsibility put upon them. From previous testimony, there's 84,000 chemicals that right now have not been analyzed or looked at by the EPA.
Has this program helped reduce toxic chemical use
Yes.
in your home state?
Yes, I don't have the exact figures, but I can tell you it has reduced toxic chemical use.
And Section 17 of the discussion draft contains extremely broad language that preempts states from implementing laws and regulations that require the collection of information about chemical substances or that restrict or prohibit the use and manufacture of those chemical substances. Senator Moore, how could this language affect your ability as a state legislator to serve your constituents?
Well, I think if we're going to be looking at state laws to protect the welfare of our citizens and the environment and looking for our state regulatory agency, the Department of Environmental Protection, I think having access to information is going to help us develop policies or state laws or regulations that are going to adequately support that need.
In addition to preempting existing state laws, Section 17 of the discussion draft preempts state and local governments from passing new laws in the future to protect human health and the environment from toxic chemicals in commerce. That's putting a lot of faith in success of our federal program. Senator Moore, are you confident that the federal program envisioned by this bill would be sufficient to protect human health and the environment from toxic chemicals?
From what I know of the legislation, at this point, I would not say so. Again, the concerns I have is that there are a lot of responsibilities put upon the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, from reviewing new chemicals to reviewing existing chemicals. I don't know the resources that they would have to actually adequately perform this function.
So then how do you see this as best working? What role should the state play and what role should the federal government play?
I think they should work hand in hand, just as I think government and business should work hand in hand in the promoting of interstate commerce, the promoting of business. I think the federal government and state government should work hand in hand, working off each other's best practices and moving those initiatives forward. I don't think any one entity can do it alone. I know, as a panelist said, that when you're dealing on international trade issues, that they want to know the policies of the federal government. Well, state government also has, when we go abroad on trade issues, they want to know what state issues are being put forth. And in conjunction, we have to work with our federal partners, but we're not always states are not always putting forward the initiatives being sought by the federal government. So there's different initiatives that each state is going to be looking at.
Well, I appreciate your testimony and that of the panelists. I agree that the best model is one that sets strong federal minimum standards, but allows our states to enact standards that respond to local needs and go above and beyond federal law to protect human health and the environment. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Bellotta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much to our panelists for being here today. Really appreciate your time and your presentations. Dr. Sowers, if I could start with a question to you. With TSCA regulating chemicals in, of course, in U.S. commerce, many of which become ingredients in consumer products, are there other departments and agencies out there that have authority over the safety of those packaged consumer products that are used in the home? And if so, would you explain the role of those other U.S. departments and agencies and how that regulatory jurisdiction compares to what we're discussing for the EPA under TSCA?
Yes, Congressman, thank you. The Procter & Gamble Company makes a whole host of consumer products. We make drugs, food products, beauty care products, laundry detergents, things like that. And different agencies regulate different products. So if I think of our food products, beauty care products, cosmetics, drugs, those are regulated by the FDA. So chemicals that go into those products that are solely used in those products would not be regulated by TSCA. They are regulated by the FDA. Now, for those chemicals that go into, say, laundry detergents, where the EPA would have a jurisdiction and would regulate those chemicals, the use of the chemical in the finished product is regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And they're the ones that regulate the use of hazardous chemicals in those products. So if something were to be declared, say, toxic, by EPA, it would probably fall within the definition of hazardous within the Federal Hazardous Substances Act, which the CPSC administers. And then the CPSC would then have a jurisdiction for labeling on the product, banning the use of the material. If they felt that labeling could not ensure safe use of it for a consumer, they could ban the use of it there. So there's a whole host of regulatory agencies overseeing these things.
Well, let me follow up. Suppose that the EPA determines a chemical is a low priority and is set aside under TSCA based on the EPA's knowledge of the chemical's limited use in the industrial environment. And that chemical may have significant hazardous properties, but the EPA understands there's a limited exposure to the chemical, and the exposure is well managed by occupational controls. What would prevent a consumer product manager like yours from using that low priority chemical in an everyday product used by families in the home?
If it was a chemical that was regulated by TSCA, then the Consumer Product Safety Commission would come into effect with its use in a finished product. And if it indeed was, say, a low priority chemical for which there was toxicity associated with it, a toxic potential, it would then be declared as hazardous by CPSC. And then there's a whole host of criteria on how hazardous materials are then handled in finished consumer products. There's a whole host of labeling requirements that would be on something like that, and the agency could also ban the use of the product if they felt that the labeling would not protect the consumer.
Mr. Goldberg, there's some people have been arguing that the United States needs a TSCA that mirrors REACH. Your company is a global company, so would you argue that having the same system would be in your interest?
Since we deal with so many different regions, I think we realize that we have to live and adapt to regional differences in the context of chemical management programs that fit the levels of both of protection, which hopefully from the BSF standpoint are consistent along all those regions, but also the individual regional differences that exist. And so while certainly from some degree we'd all love in the abstract world harmonization that made it easier to live with, the fact of the matter is there are differences. And the schemes among these various regions can be very different. REACH is a very, very different scheme, even down to its basic nature than TSCA is. And so while there are learnings, and as Mr. Jones said, there are some benefits that we can take moving from region to region, for example, sharing of data, at the end of the day, we realize the need to adapt and be responsive to individual chemical management regimes.
So you agree that it would be important for the U.S. to have a system that is unique just to the United States?
Yes, I mean in the context of the European system, for example, it is not a chemical management system. The way we think of it here is really largely at least at its start, an information gathering system that is registrant or company based, as opposed to a substance based system that we have here. Changing that would require a rather dramatic overhaul, and as I've discussed with some of my colleagues, even in the environmental community, it's not a system I think that adapts itself well necessarily here.
Okay, so you think the lessons of REACH that the United States should avoid in TSCA would be that's not adapting well?
Well, I think there are a number of lessons we've learned about REACH, including the bureaucracy that's revolved around it, the costs, ongoing costs involved, which have not necessarily established themselves with measured levels of protection, because to date it's been about information gathering and not about risk management. And the goals of modernizing TSCA, as I said, is one of my principles, is to provide EPA with additional authority to actually manage risks.
Gentlemen's times.
Thank you very much,
Well
Chairman.
expired.
My time's expired, and I yield back. Thank you for your indulgence.
Chair now recognizes gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank the Chairman. I also want to make sure the Chairman understands that we appreciate your bipartisan effort. I don't think we're there yet, Mr. Chairman, but if we keep working together, we'll get there. One of the things, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to want to change and improve TSCA. One of them, I think, is that there's a lack of confidence in the public in chemical safety in this country, and I think that's a problem that the companies, the businesses would want to address firmly. And it's one of my concerns with the Chemical and Commerce Act, is that it may actually go in the wrong direction, reducing public's confidence in our chemical safety in this country. Mr. Grayhouse, would you respond to that?
I think that is the concern, and that's why we counseled that we really focus in on the idea of safety, of a definition of it, and a standard that the public health community, and not just the ones I represent, but other folks, the American Public Health Association, the pediatricians, others, all agree is something that would protect people, legal authority to then implement what is needed to protect people after review against that safety standard, and funding and direction for EPA to make progress in making those decisions. And that's what we still don't see in this bill because of the issues that came up in Mr. Jones' testimony. And so we're concerned about that. And then there's also, there are areas where some of the tools that EPA uses right now to provide protection for people are rolled back. We've highlighted the new chemicals program, and these tools are not ones that we think do the job to protect people from new chemicals, but they're at least there. EPA has sort of stitched together the ability to order testing and impose restrictions at different times, but some of that's rolled back. And then you have the increase in secrecy on chemicals in the bill with the explicit requirement that identity is hidden even when it is linked to a health and safety study. And so I think that those things, we need to beef up the first thing and pull back on the other things I mentioned where the existing program is pulled back.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, or Senator Moore, the right to know laws are often used by states to protect their citizens. If this provision is stripped, how do you think it will affect the NCSL's work in ensuring public safety?
Would have to look at the implications of the state. Well, I guess we couldn't look at it on a state-by-state basis because this would then preempt the states having the right to implement the right to know law. So it's not even an issue that you could go back to each state legislature or administrator and how do we get around this? If this preemption applies to the right to know law, there's nothing that the states could actually do to protect their public safety employees or workers who are being exposed to these types of chemicals.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sowers, my understanding is that Procter & Gamble is working to reduce animal use in testings. How do you feel that fits in with Chemicals and Safety, Chemicals and Commerce Act?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Yes, we're very sensitive about the use of animals in safety testing. As a company, we've invested about $350 million on the development of alternatives. We appreciate very much the provisions that are stated in here that promote the use of animal alternatives using structure-activity relationships and things like that. So it is well represented and appreciated.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Would the gentleman yield for a preemption question? Because I think there's a lot of confusion. And so for Mr. Greenwood, how do you think preemption works? Does it, as we've heard, completely tie the hands, or does it just preempt as EPA acts on an individual chemical?
That has been the latter point is my understanding. When EPA acts, then there is the invocation of preemption, but it has to be the action of the agency which then accomplishes that.
So if there's no action, there's no preemption?
No, that's my understanding. That's how I've read the bill.
Okay. And thank you, Mike. And
I'm going to yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank this panel here for being here today with us, and particularly want to welcome a former colleague, Cal Dooley, with whom I was privileged to serve in the House of Representatives and representing a lovely district not very far from my own home, and it's a pleasure to have you be a part of this panel. As we heard from the first panel, the bill before us fails to require protection of vulnerable populations in managing identified risks of existing chemicals. This fundamental flaw, in my opinion, could put women, children, the elderly, the disabled, workers, and residents of hotspot communities at serious risk. Any TSCA reform bill this committee considers should really ensure the protection of vulnerable populations. And I'd like to begin by discussing the specifics of how we could ensure that protection. I've asked some questions of our EPA witness about specific requirements. I want to follow up on that with you, Mr. Egregius. Mr. Egregius, do you think that a chemical that is dangerous to a vulnerable population should be able to pass the safety standard under a reformed TSCA?
No.
Can you explain whether the current draft offers that protection?
We think it doesn't provide the protection.
Does your coalition, Mr. Egregius, believe that risk management decisions must ensure that significant risks to vulnerable populations are addressed?
Yes, we do.
And does the current draft ensure that vulnerable populations are protected from the risks identified when evaluating existing chemicals?
We believe that it does not. I could get into the details, but it does not.
Well, I'll give you a chance to do that. Are there some specific changes that you would recommend that we need to include in such legislation as reforming TSCA to ensure strong protections for vulnerable populations?
Well, one of the key ones is right now the assessment does specify that they look at vulnerable populations, but against a standard that we still don't know exactly what it means in the bill, and I think we've identified that. It doesn't require that you aggregate the exposure to the vulnerable populations, and that's a key issue because there might be multiple vulnerable populations for the same chemical. You look at flame retardants, you have firefighters who now have a cancer prevention project that's about their disproportionate exposure to these chemicals when they go into fires. That's higher exposure for an adult, but then you might have children where there's a smaller amount of exposure could cause harm when the chemicals are used as directed in the home. And you want to make sure that the EPA is mapping the exposures, all the exposures that either of those groups has against them, and then devising the restrictions to make sure that they can only be used in a safe way and that the harm isn't occurring. And I think the absence of aggregate exposure in the assessment, and then the key thing that was talked about a lot in the discussion by Mr. Jones is if EPA ultimately can't impose the restrictions needed to ensure the safety, then a lot of that is academic. You don't want to have all this risk identified and then not be able to actually go ahead and impose the restrictions. So for those reasons, we think that it does not, even though vulnerable populations and a decent definition of it are in the bill, they're not actually protected by all the provisions.
So it looks like there's some technology or capability of identifying the risks and of actually, at least better than we are now, mitigating them. Would that be your assessment?
It definitely is. I think I cite the model of the pesticide program, and we can't import all the details of it here, but the basic idea of that you look at vulnerable populations, you add up the exposures, you impose the needed restrictions. That's a model that we've had in effect. There have been measurable public health improvements from it, so we know it can be done. It's just, is there the will to do it?
Right, but there is a pathway, or there is some precedent for doing this. Finally, could you speak to the public's opinion, because you work a lot with the public opinion on this topic as well. I would think that properly protecting children and seniors and the other vulnerable populations would, from the effects of dangerous chemicals, should be fairly widespread. The enthusiasm for it might be a popular topic. What's your idea here?
Yes, it's there's the support for protecting pregnant women and children from toxic chemicals in the sense of that there's a concern about chemicals now that they could be having an effect on a lot of the chronic disease that we see in the country is widespread. And so you'd be on solid ground in taking action to do all those things with public opinion. I can provide the details on that.
I appreciate that. So in order to effectively reform TSCA, the bill before us needs significant revisions regarding the protection of vulnerable populations, and there's a will in the country to do that, or there's a desire to do this. So I urge my colleagues and the stakeholders on this panel to refuse to support any, at least that's my opinion, that we shouldn't support any TSCA reform bill that creates the illusion of progress while still leaving these vulnerable populations unprotected. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. We want to, seeing no other members, I have a unanimous consent request to place some letters into the record. A letter from 3M Corporation, a letter from 13 Attorney Generals, the American Association for Justice, Texas Campaign for the Environment, Moms Clean Air Force, National Hispanic Medical Association, National Medical Association, American Public Health Association, a number of health care organizations, a letter from 72 health professional, public health and environment and public interest groups. And that's it? Not this letter? Okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was right. Staff was wrong. Note that down for the first time. And also a letter I received from Ranking Member Waxman and Ranking Member Tonko on this legislation and hydraulic fracturing. Without objection, so ordered. We want to thank you. This is a tough issue. You guys are all the experts. We do want to continue open discussions and comments, language, anything. You can come in and see me. Important piece of legislation, and we learned a lot today. We appreciate your participation with that. I'll adjourn the hearing.
We have to get up in sequence.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah.